The Cold Dawn and the Hearth, the year 1776, in colonial America, did not begin with the flash of a musket or the ringing of a bell, but with the biting, persistent chill of a New England winter morning. As a member of a typical farming family, your day began long before the sun dared to crest the horizon. The air inside the small, timber framed house was often just as cold as the air outside, save for the lingering scent of wood smoke from the previous night's fire. Your first movement of the day was pulling yourself away from the heavy wool blankets and the warmth of a straw filled mattress. The wooden floorboards beneath your feet were ice cold and groaned with every step, a familiar, rhythmic protest against the stillness of the dawn. There were no light switches to flip. Instead, you felt your way toward the great hearth, the literal heart of the home. Your primary task was to find the living embers buried deep beneath the gray ash. Using a small iron poker, you would gently uncover the glowing orange coals, breathing life into them with a steady, patient stream of air from a hand bellows. If the fire had gone out completely, it was a minor disaster, requiring a trip to a neighbor's house to borrow a burning brand, as matches were still decades away from invention. Once the kindling caught, the crackle of dry oak and maple provided the only soundtrack to the morning. A heavy, cast iron pot, swinging on a crane, was filled with water drawn from the well. The rope of the well was stiff with frost, scratching your palms as you hauled the bucket up, the splash of the water echoing in the silent yard. Breakfast was a repetitive affair, usually hasty pudding, a thick cornmeal mush that required constant stirring with a long wooden paddle to prevent scorching. The steam rose in thick clouds, smelling of toasted grain and wood smoke. You ate from a wooden trencher or a dull pewter plate, using a spoon carved from horn. There was no rush, only the slow, methodical preparation for a day defined by physical endurance. The light coming through the small, leaded glass window panes was distorted and gray, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Your clothes, made of coarse, linsey woolsey, were heavy and smelled of the sheep they came from, and the lye soap used to scrub them weeks prior. There was a profound heaviness to everything: the iron pots, the damp wood, the very air itself, creating a sense of time that moved not by the minute, but by the slow burn of the log in the fireplace. The midday labors and the community. By midday, the world of 1776 revealed itself as a landscape of immense distance and quiet isolation. Life was a series of manual processes that modern minds would find agonizingly slow. If you needed a tool repaired or a horse shod, it meant a long, rhythmic walk or a bumpy wagon ride down rutted dirt paths that were either frozen solid or turned into a quagmire of mud. The community was held together by the sounds of labor, the distant, rhythmic thwack of an axe against timber, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, and the lowing of oxen pulling a stone sledge. There was no such thing as a quick trip to the store. Most goods were bartered: a bushel of apples for a pound of nails, a day's labor for a gallon of cider. Inside the home, the midday meal was often a continuation of the morning's stew, perhaps flavored with a bit of salt pork that had been curing in a barrel for months. The primary industry of the household was the production of textiles. The spinning wheel was a constant companion, its low, hypnotic hum filling the afternoon hours. To produce a single shirt required weeks of carding, spinning, weaving, and sewing by hand. Every stitch was an investment of time. News of the burgeoning revolution reached the rural interior like a slow moving tide. A traveler might pass through with a week's old newspaper or a rumor of a declaration signed in Philadelphia. But for the average person, the price of grain and the health of the livestock were far more pressing concerns than the politics of King George. The silence of the countryside was absolute, broken only by the wind through the pines or the occasional call of a crow. People spoke less and listened more, their movements dictated by the limitations of their own muscles and the tools they had forged themselves. Every fence post was hand hewn, every stone in the pasture wall was lifted and placed with a grunt of exertion. This was a world where boredom was simply the rhythm of survival, a steady, unblinking focus on the task at hand, whether it was tilling a rocky field or boiling tallow for candles. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent, the shadows of the leafless trees stretching long across the snow, signaling the transition from the labor of the field to the labor of the home. The long shadows and the dying ember as the sun dipped below the tree line. The world of 1776 contracted until it was no larger than the circle of light cast by the hearth. Evening was a time of enforced stillness. Artificial light was a luxury. Candles were made of smelly animal fat, known as tallow, which dripped and smoked, or more expensive beeswax saved for special occasions. To save money, families often sat in the gloaming, the half-light of dusk, talking in low tones about the chores for the following day. There were no distractions, no screens, no humming appliances, no distant traffic. The night was a heavy, physical presence that pressed against the windows. Dinner was a quiet affair, followed perhaps by the rhythmic scratching of a quill pen if the father was keeping a ledger, or the soft clicking of knitting needles. Stories told by the elders were the primary form of entertainment, tales of ancestors who had crossed the ocean or legends of the woods that bordered the clearing. These stories were repeated so often they became like a chant, lulling the younger children into a state of semi-sleep. Before retiring, the final duty was banking the fire, covering the logs with a thick layer of ash to ensure they would smolder until morning. The walk to the sleeping loft was a journey into the dark, guided only by a small tin lantern. The beds were often shared, providing communal warmth against the freezing drafts that whistled through the gaps in the logs. You would climb under a mountain of quilts, feeling the scratch of the wool and the rustle of the straw ticking beneath you. The silence outside was profound, a deep, prehistoric quiet that modern ears rarely encounter. Occasionally, the howl of a wolf or the snap of a frozen branch would punctuate the stillness, but otherwise, the world slept in total darkness. As you closed your eyes, the last thing you would see was the faint, dying red glow of the hearth downstairs reflecting off the rafters. There was no anxiety about the future, only a deep, bone-weary acceptance of the present. Tomorrow would be exactly like today. The same cold floor, the same hasty pudding, the same rhythmic labor. a cycle of life that had remained unchanged for generations, moving at the pace of a season, slow and certain as the turning of the earth. The seasonal rhythms and the quiet forest as winter transitioned into the late, muddy thaws of 1776, the pace of life shifted but never quickened. This period, often called mud season, brought a peculiar kind of isolation. The frozen ruts of the roads turned into deep, sucking mires that could swallow a wagon wheel to the hub. Travel became nearly impossible, confining families to their immediate acreage for weeks at a time. During these long gray afternoons, the focus shifted to the maintenance of wood and iron, the sound of a whetstone against a scythe, a long metallic shing shing shing, became the dominant note of the day. Every blade in the house, from the heavy felling axe to the small kitchen knife, had to be sharpened by hand. This was a slow, meditative task, requiring a steady rhythm and a keen eye. The smell of oil and cold metal filled the lean-to sheds. Beyond the cleared fields lay the great forest, an intimidating wall of ancient oak, hemlock, and pine. For the colonial settler, the woods were both a pantry and a threat. You might spend an entire afternoon walking through the undergrowth just to find the right curved limb of an ash tree to fashion a new handle for a plow. There was no lumber yard. There was only the tree, the saw, and the immense passage of time it took to transform one into the other. The silence of the woods was heavy, broken only by the occasional thump of snow falling from a high branch or the rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker. Inside the house, the primary task was often sugar on snow or the early tapping of maple trees if the days were warm enough. The sap would drip into wooden buckets with a slow hypnotic plink, plink, plink. Boiling that sap down into syrup took hours of standing over a steaming cauldron, watching the amber liquid bubble and thicken. It was a test of patience where the reward was measured in mere ounces. People lived in a state of constant, quiet observation, watching the thickness of the squirrel's fur or the height of the hornet's nests to predict the coming spring. There was a deep, unspoken connection to the soil that dictated every thought. You didn't just live on the land, you were part of its slow, seasonal digestion, the Sabbath and the weight of silence. Sunday in 1776 was not a day of rest in the modern sense, but a day of intense, focused stillness. The Sabbath was the anchor of the week, a day where the usual clatter of the farm went silent. No axes swung, no spinning wheels hummed, and no hammers rang. This sudden absence of work noise made the world feel unnaturally large. The journey to the local meeting house was often the only time you saw people outside your own family. The meeting house itself was a stark, unheated wooden box. You would sit on hard wooden pews for hours, the cold seeping through your thickest wool coat, listening to a sermon that moved as slowly as a glacier. There was no music, no colorful windows, and no cushions, only the voice of the minister echoing against the rafters. People brought small foot stoves, wooden boxes with a few hot coals inside to keep their toes from freezing. The social interaction after the service was hushed and brief, conducted in the graveyard or on the porch, consisting of quiet inquiries about a neighbor's health or the survival of their winter stores. Then the long walk back home, in the fading afternoon light began. The evening of the Sabbath was spent in even deeper silence, often reading the Bible by the flickering light of a single tallow dip. The children were expected to sit quietly, their hands folded, reflecting on the gravity of existence. This forced inactivity created a unique mental space, a vacuum of sound that allowed for a level of introspection almost impossible to find today. You became acutely aware of the smallest sounds, the settling of the house's timber, the sigh of the wind in the chimney, the rhythmic breathing of a sleeping dog. The weight of the silence was not oppressive. It was simply the atmosphere of the age. It was a day that stretched the perception of time, making a single afternoon feel like an entire week. By the time the sun set on a Sunday, the prospect of returning to the hard, scrabble labor of Monday felt like a relief. The cycle would begin again, a slow rotation of work and worship that provided a sturdy, if boring, framework for a life lived at the very edge of the wilderness. The humidity of July and the slow scythe as July 1776 arrived, the biting frost was replaced by a thick, heavy humidity that clung to the valleys of the American colonies. The air became a tangible weight, smelling of damp earth, ripening clover, and the pungent sweat of oxen. This was the season of the hay harvest, the most critical and exhausting period of the agricultural year. There were no machines to automate this process. There was only the rhythmic, sweeping motion of the scythe. You would stand at the edge of a vast meadow at dawn, the dew still clinging to the tall timothy grass, and begin the repetitive swing, swish, step, swish. The blade had to be kept at a precise angle to the ground, a skill learned through years of blistered palms and aching lower backs. The heat of the midday sun was relentless, filtered through a haze of dust and pollen. Water was carried to the fields in wooden firkins, often mixed with a bit of vinegar and molasses to create switchel, a colonial electrolyte drink that cut through the thirst better than lukewarm water. Every few minutes, the work would stop for the honing, the high-pitched, metallic rasp of a whetstone against the steel blade. This sound, echoing from farm to farm across the hills, was the true anthem of an American summer. The grass was left to dry in the sun, requiring constant turning with wooden pitchforks. If a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, the work became a frantic, yet still slow motion race to gather the hay before it rotted. The evening didn't bring much relief, as the stagnant air inside the timber houses remained thick with heat, and the constant hum of cicadas provided a relentless, vibrating backdrop to a restless night's sleep on a damp corn husk mattress. The loom, the lie, and the infinite stitch. While the men were occupied with the hay, the interior life of the home in 1776 centered on the grueling, slow motion chemistry of survival. One of the most monotonous tasks was the making of soap. It began with the leaching of ashes saved from the winter hearth. Water was poured through these ashes to create lye, a caustic liquid that could burn the skin. This lye was then boiled in a massive iron cauldron over an outdoor fire mixed with pails of rendered animal fat. The mixture had to be stirred for hours on end with a long wooden pole until it reached the consistency of thick porridge. The smell was acrid and heavy, a far cry from the scented soaps of the future. Once cooled, it was cut into dull, brown bars that would last the family for a year. Simultaneously, the great wheel for wool and the smaller flax wheel never truly stopped. Spinning was the background noise of womanhood. It was done while watching the stew, while listening to the elders, and even while rocking a cradle with a foot. The transformation of raw flax, a stiff, straw-like plant, into soft linen was a process of infinite steps, rippling, rotting, retting, breaking, scutching, and heckling. Each step produced a fine, sneezing dust that coated the furniture. To produce enough thread for a single pair of breeches took miles of walking back and forth beside the spinning wheel. Time was measured not in hours, but in skeins and yards. Life was an endless series of small, repetitive movements, the flick of a wrist, the push of a treadle, the pull of a needle, building a civilization, one stitch at a time, in the quiet heat of a colonial afternoon. The golden haze and the harvest moon as September 1776 rolled in, the vibrant greens of the colonial landscape began to burnish into deep golds and rusts. This was the season of the harvest home, but it was less a celebration and more an exhausting month-long marathon. The primary focus was Indian corn, the backbone of the American diet. Unlike modern harvesting, every ear was plucked by hand, the dry husks rasping against calloused fingers like sandpaper. The sound of the harvest was the dry, hollow thud of corn ears hitting the bottom of a wooden cart. Once gathered, the husking bee began. Neighbors would gather in the flickering light of lanterns, sitting on piles of stalks, their hands moving in a blur of repetitive motion. Rip, tuck, throw. The air was filled with the sweet, dusty smell of dried corn silk and the earthy aroma of pumpkins curing in the sun. Apples were another monumental task. They had to be gathered, peeled, cored, and sliced for drying or hauled to the cider press. The press was a massive wooden contraption that groaned under the weight of a hand-turned screw, slowly bleeding out the tart, cloudy juice that would provide the primary beverage for the winter. This was a time of putting up, filling the root cellar with barrels of salted meat, crates of sand-packed carrots, and jugs of molasses. The physical toll was immense, leaving everyone with aching shoulders and stained hands. Yet there was a deep, quiet satisfaction in watching the larder fill, knowing each jar was a shield against the coming hunger. The gathering gloom and the first frost by November, the golden haze had vanished, replaced by a stark, skeletal landscape and a sky the color of cold pewter. The first killing frost arrived silently in the night, turning the remaining garden greens into black slime and glazing the puddles in the barnyard with brittle ice. This was the season of the shedding, where the outdoors was abandoned for the sanctuary of the hearth. Life became an exercise in insulation. Every crack in the log walls was stuffed with fresh mud or moss, and heavy, heavy quilts were hung over the doors to block the death drafts. The sounds of the world outside were muffled by the thickening air, leaving only the internal sounds of the house, the rhythmic bubbling of the cider fermenting in the cellar, and the scratching of a quill as the year's accounts were tallied. Slaughtering season arrived with the first sustained cold. It was a grim, necessary labor conducted in the biting air. Pigs and cattle were processed into hams, bacons, and steaks, which were then hung in the smokehouse for weeks. The smell of hickory and maple smoke became a permanent fixture of your clothes and hair. This was also the time for candle making in earnest. The summer's saved tallow was melted down in the vast pots, and you would spend an entire day dipping wicks up and down into the fatty liquid. Each dip added a microscopic layer of wax, a process that felt as slow as the growth of a tree. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the family retreated further into the circle of firelight. The world felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the first true blizzard to seal the doors and complete the cycle that had begun in the cold dawn of January. The deep freeze and the echo of 1770. The end of the year in 1776 did not bring a celebration of New Year's Eve as we know it today. Instead, it brought the deep freeze. By late December, the landscape had been transformed into a silent, monochromatic world of white and gray. The ponds and rivers, which were the highways of the colonies, were now solid sheets of ice, thick enough to support a team of oxen and a loaded sledge. This was the time of the great interiority. The world outside was no longer a place of labor, but a place of passage, quickly crossed to reach the woodpile or the well. The primary sound of existence was the rhythmic thud of the felling axe in the distance, as wood was harvested not for building, but for the insatiable hunger of the fireplace. Inside the home, the family lived in a state of semi-hibernation. The keeping room was the only space where life existed. To move into a bedroom was to enter a vault of ice. You slept with a heavy soapstone, heated in the oven and wrapped in flannel, pressed against your feet to prevent frostbite. The air was so dry from the fire that the wooden furniture would groan and pop in the night as the joints shrank. This was the season of the long mending. Every tool, every garment, and every harness was inspected and repaired by the flickering light of a single tallow dip. The silence was so profound that you could hear the snow piling up against the door, a soft brushing sound that felt like the earth itself was trying to bury the house. The lingering twilight and the ghost of the frontier as the calendar turned toward 1777. The psychological weight of the revolution began to seep into even the most isolated homesteads. The boring history of daily chores was now punctuated by the arrival of a weary soldier on horseback or the sudden disappearance of a neighbor's son to join the Continental Army. However, the work never stopped. There was no time off for war. The women took on the heavy labor of the men, hauling timber, slaughtering livestock, and managing the accounts. The slow, rhythmic pace of the spinning wheel now hummed with a sense of urgency, producing blankets and socks for the boys. In the field, the winter nights felt longer than ever. You would sit by the hearth, watching the blue flames dance over the oak logs, thinking about the vastness of the American continent that lay beyond the trees. There were no maps in your head, only the knowledge of the next town and the rumors of the great mountains to the west. Life was a tiny, candle-lit circle in an ocean of darkness. You lived by the old ways, the moon's phases, the behavior of the birds, and the ancient wisdom of the Bible. There was a stoic, unmoving quality To the colonial spirit, you didn't expect comfort, you expected endurance. The transition into the new year was marked not by a clock striking midnight, but by the slow, inevitable return of the sun, minute by minute, day by day, as the light began to linger just a few seconds longer on the frozen windowsills. The infinite cycle and the soil's promise. As the final weeks of the epic of 1776 drew to a close, the cycle prepared to reset itself. The woodpile was lower, the cider barrels were half empty, and the seed corn was being carefully guarded in the driest corner of the loft. This was the true nature of history, not the grand battles or the signing of documents, but the infinite repetition of small, boring acts of survival. Every meal cooked, every thread spun, and every furrow plowed was a brick in the foundation of a new nation. The people of 1776 did not feel like they were living in a historical era. They felt like they were living in a long, cold, and demanding present. The legacy they left was one of silence and patience. They understood something that the modern world has forgotten, that time has its own weight, and that anything of value takes a very, very long time to grow. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the smell of that cold wood smoke, the feel of the rough linen sheets, and the absolute, total silence of a 1776 night. The fire in the hearth is now just a bed of glowing coals, radiating a steady, fading heat. The house is settled. The world is still. The long, slow story of the American life continues, one quiet breath at a time, into the dawn of a new century, the thaw and the returning song of the earth. The transition from the deep freeze of 1776 into the early spring of 1777 was not a sudden burst of warmth, but a grueling, month-long struggle. Between ice and mud, the silence of winter was slowly replaced by the sound of water, the constant, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from the eaves of the house. As the snowpack finally surrendered, the air changed, losing its sharp, metallic edge and taking on the scent of wet pine needles and decaying leaf mold. This was sugar season, the bridge between the seasons where the frost was still in the ground, but the sun began to warm the bark of the maples. Life during this thaw was lived in a state of dampness. Your boots, handcrafted from heavy cowhide, were never truly dry. They sat by the hearth every night, steaming and smelling of tallow and wet leather. The daily chore of fetching wood became a battle against the frost heaves, where the earth itself seemed to buckle and shift, spitting up stones that had been buried for years. These stones had to be cleared and added to the pasture walls, a back-breaking task that involved prying them from the suction of the mud with iron bars. The physical world was heavy, unyielding, and messy, demanding a level of patience that defined the colonial character, the Candlemas, and the inventory of survival. In the early months of the new year, the family conducted a quiet, essential inventory. This was the time of Candlemas, the midpoint of winter. In the dim light of the cellar, you would count the remaining barrels of salt pork, the dwindling hills of potatoes, and the shriveled apples. Every meal was a calculation. The luxury of the harvest was gone. Now, it was about stretching the remaining stores until the first wild greens, dandelions, and ramps poked through the softening earth. The monotony of the diet was absolute: cornmeal mush, salt fish, and perhaps a bit of dried venison. Entertainment was as sparse as the food. The primary social outlet was the storytelling, where the same tales were told in the same chairs by the same people. There was a comfort in this repetition. You knew every inflection in your grandfather's voice as he spoke of the starving time of earlier generations. This oral tradition served as the family's library, its theater, and its history book. The children would sit on the floor, their eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire, as the words wove a tapestry of continuity across the decades. The house was a fortress against the vast, unknown wilderness, and the family was the garrison. The First Furrow and the Eternal Return by Pow, April 1777. The mud had finally firmed into soil, and the true work of the new year began: the breaking of the ground. The plow, a heavy wooden frame tipped with a hand-forged iron share, was dragged out of the barn. Hitching the oxen was a slow, deliberate ritual: the clanking of the chains, the heavy wooden yoke settling onto the animal's shoulders, and the low, guttural commands of the farmer. The first furrow of the season was a sacred moment. As the iron sliced through the earth, it released the smell of the deep soil, dark, rich, and full of the promise of life. You followed behind the plow, your feet sinking into the cool, damp earth, dropping kernels of seed corn into the wounds in the ground. This was the ultimate act of faith. In a world of war, political upheaval, and uncertain futures, the act of planting was a statement of permanence. The boring history had come full circle. The seasons would turn, the sun would rise and set, and the people would continue to labor in the quiet, steady rhythm that had sustained them since the first foot was set on the continent. As the light of 1777 grew stronger, the memory of 1776 faded into the foundations of the house, becoming just another layer of ash in the great hearth, another stitch in the infinite quilt of time. The rising sap and the labor of the orchard. As the late spring of 1777 finally conquered the lingering shadows of winter, the focus of colonial life shifted to the orchards, the source of the liquid gold that sustained the spirits of the settlers. Every farm in 1776 had its stand of apple trees, but they were not the manicured, sweet varieties of the modern world. These were rugged, sour spitters, meant for the cider press rather than the hand. The labor of spring involved the meticulous pruning of these trees using hand-forged saws and heavy curved knives. You would spend hours perched on a wooden ladder, your neck aching as you looked upward, removing the dead wood to allow the new growth to breathe. The air was filled with the faint, sweet scent of apple blossoms, a fragrance that provided a rare moment of sensory beauty in a life defined by utility. The soil beneath the trees had to be turned by hand with a heavy iron spade. This was a slow, rhythmic task, placing the spade, pushing with the weight of your body, and turning the earth to expose the roots to the strengthening sun. There was no conversation, only the sound of the metal biting into the dirt and the occasional song of a returning bluebird. In the colonial mind, an orchard was a legacy you planted for your grandchildren, just as your grandfather had planted for you. This long term thinking created a sense of permanence and peace. As you worked, the sun warmed your shoulders through your linen shirt, and the repetitive motion of digging became a form of moving meditation, a way to anchor yourself to the ground while the world of men and politics remained in a state of chaotic flux. The sheep shearing and the gift of the fleece in May, when the weather was finally settled and the sheep wash rains had passed, the annual shearing began. This was one of the most physically demanding, yet quietly satisfying tasks of the year. The sheep, heavy with a year's worth of thick, oily wool, had to be caught and wrestled to the ground. There were no electric shears. There were only the large, hand forged iron snips that required a strong grip and a steady hand. You would sit on a low stool in the shade of the barn, the sheep's head tucked under your arm, and begin the slow process of unzipping the fleece. The sound was a rhythmic snip, 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 accompanied by the smell of lanolin, the natural oil of the sheep, which coated your hands and made them soft despite the rough work. The fleece would come off in one large, heavy blanket of cream-colored wool. This was the raw material for the family's clothing for the next year. Once sheared, the wool had to be skirted, cleaned of briars, mud, and debris, a task that required hours of standing at a wooden table, picking through the fibers with infinite patience. This was a time of communal labor, where the women and children would join in, their hands moving in a synchronized dance of sorting and cleaning. The world of 1776 was built on the back of the sheep, and the weight of that wool in your arms was the weight of security against the next winter. The afternoon would drift by in a haze of dust and lanolin, the only urgency being the need to finish before the sun dipped below the barn roof. The infinite fence and the boundaries of home, with the livestock out in the pastures, the maintenance of the great walls, became the primary occupation of the late spring afternoons. In the colonies, specifically in New England, the earth grew stones every winter as the frost pushed them to the surface. Clearing these stones was a never-ending cycle. You would hitch the stone sledge, a flat wooden platform without wheels, to the oxen and move slowly across the fields, picking up the granite rocks that had appeared since the last thaw. Each stone was a unique puzzle piece. Building a dry stack wall required no mortar, only the skill of finding the right face for each rock so that gravity would hold it in place for a century. This was the ultimate boring task. It was slow, heavy, and required a level of concentration that shut out the rest of the world. You would lift a stone, feel its cold, rough texture, rotate it in your hands, and settle it into the gap in the wall. If it wobbled, you took it off and tried again. The wall was a boundary, a defense, and a testament to your presence on the land. By the end of the day, your fingers would be bruised, and your back would feel like a bent bow. But when you looked back at the 50 feet of wall you had repaired, you saw a line of order in the chaos of the wilderness. The sun would set behind the mountains, casting long, jagged shadows of the stones across the grass, and you would walk back to the house in the deepening twilight. The silence of the fields, echoing the silence in your own mind, the summer kitchen, and the humidity of the hearth as the calendar pushed deep into the summer of 1777, the heat inside the colonial home became an almost physical presence. To avoid turning the main living area into an oven, much of the daily labor migrated to the summer kitchen, often a lean to or a separate small structure where the fire could roar without suffocating the sleeping quarters. Here, the air was a thick soup of wood smoke, boiling vinegar, and the sweet, heavy scent of ripening berries. This was the season of the quick harvest, where the wild strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries had to be gathered and preserved before the birds or the rot claimed them. You would spend hours standing over a large brass kettle, stirring a bubbling mixture of fruit and sugar, if you were lucky enough to have it, or honey. The wooden spoon moved in slow, hypnotic circles, dragging through the thickening jam. The sound was a rhythmic shloop, shloop against the sides of the pot. Preserving was not a hobby, it was a desperate race against time. Every jar of jam or shrub, a fruit preserved vinegar, was a taste of summer stored for the bleak, white months of January. The heat of the fire, combined with the humidity of the July air, made your linen shirt cling to your back. But the work demanded a steady hand. One moment of inattention, and the precious sugar would scorch, ruining a week's worth of gathering. The drowsy midday and the shimmering fields. There was a specific time in a colonial July, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, when the world seemed to stop breathing. The heat reached such a peak that even the oxen would stand motionless under the shade of a great oak, their tails flicking lazily at flies. This was the drowsy hour. If the chores allowed, you might find a spot in the barn's hayloft where the air smelled of dried grass and dust. Looking out across the fields, the heat waves made the distant tree line shimmer and dance as if the landscape were underwater. The sounds of the afternoon were sparse and distant. The dry, rhythmic chirr of a cicada, the occasional creak of a weathercock, and the soft, muffled cooing of pigeons in the rafters. There was no air conditioning, only the movement of a slight breeze through the open barn doors. You lived by the pace of the sun. When it was too hot to plow, you mended harnesses or sharpened tools in the shade. This forced rest was a vital part of the colonial rhythm. It was a time for quiet contemplation, where the mind could wander as slowly as a cloud across the blue New England skies. The world felt ancient and unchangeable, a vast expanse of green and gold, where the only clock was the slow movement of the shadows across the barn floor. The well pole and the weight of water. Water was the invisible burden of 1776. Every drop used for drinking, cooking, washing, or watering the livestock had to be hauled by human muscle. The well sweep, a long, counterbalanced pole, was the centerpiece of the yard. The movement of drawing water was a vertical dance, pulling the rope down to sink the bucket, hearing the distant, hollow kerplunk from the cool depths, and then guiding the heavy, dripping pail back to the surface. The water was crystalline and bitingly cold. Even in the height of summer, you would carry 2 pails at a time, suspended from a wooden yoke across your shoulders. The weight was immense, pressing the yoke into your muscles, requiring a wide, swinging gait to keep the water from sloshing out. Each trip from the well to the kitchen or the troughs was a slow, deliberate journey. You became acutely aware of the value of water, how much was needed to scrub a floor, how much a cow could drink in a single afternoon, how much was required to cool a fever. The repetitive nature of this task, back and forth, well to house to well, created a mental map of the yard that you could navigate in total darkness. As the sun began to set, the final trip to the well was a ritual of closure, the cool water reflecting the first few stars of the evening in its dark, circular mirror, the dog days, and the infinite hum of August. The transition into August 1777 brought the dog days, a period where time seemed to thicken like the humid air. The vibrant greens of early summer had faded into a dusty, tired olive, and the earth beneath your feet was cracked and parched. The sounds of the world were dominated by a single, unending vibration, the dry, electric scream of the cicadas in the high branches of the elms. It was a sound that didn't just reach your ears, it resonated in your bones, a constant reminder of the relentless heat. In the fields, the pace of work slowed to a crawl. The primary task was hoeing the hills, moving through the rows of corn to chop away the persistent weeds that competed for the dwindling moisture in the soil. Each strike of the heavy iron, hoe against the dry earth, sent up a small puff of gray dust that settled on your boots and shins. The sun was a white hot weight on the back of your neck, and your shadow was a small, dark puddle beneath you. You moved down the row with a robotic, unthinking precision. Strike, pull, step, strike, pull, step. There were no thoughts of the future or the past, only the rhythmic contact of metal on earth. The corn was now head high, a rustling forest of green blades that trapped the heat and blocked any chance of a cooling breeze. To walk through the rows was to enter a private, stifling world where the only smell was the sweet, sickly scent of ripening corn tassels and the dry aroma of baked dirt, the laundry day, and the alchemy of ash while the fields baked. The great wash took place near the creek, a task so monumental and exhausting that it happened only a few times a season. This was a 3-day process that defined the very essence of boring history. Day 1 was the soaking, where heavy linen sheets, wool blankets, and coarse shirts were submerged in cold water to loosen the grime of months of labor. Day 2 was the bucking, where the clothes were placed in a large wooden tub and doused with a hot solution of lye water made from wood ashes. The lye acted as a harsh bleach, and the smell of wet linen and caustic ash was overpowering. You would spend the entire day bent over a scrubbing board or using a dolly, a wooden tool used to churn the clothes. The physical toll on your hands was immense. The lye turned your skin red and raw, and the weight of the wet wool was enough to strain the strongest back. Every garment had to be wrung out by hand, a slow, twisting motion that required every ounce of grip strength. Finally, the clothes were spread out on the grass or hung over stone walls to dry in the sun. The sight of a dozen white linen shirts laid out on a green field was one of the few visual rewards of the week. As they dried, the fabric stiffened in the heat, taking on the scent of the sun and the clover. By the third day, the task of folding and mangling, smoothing, the laundry began, a repetitive, rhythmic folding that signaled the end of the ordeal. The twilight of the year and the first golden leafless August bled into September. A subtle, almost imperceptible change crept in the late afternoon light. The sun, though still hot, began to cast a more golden, slanted glow across the pastures. The drowsy hour grew slightly longer, and for the first time in months, the air at night carried a faint, crisp promise of the coming frost. This was the season of the first harvest, the gathering of the garden crops that couldn't wait for the great autumn reaping. You would spend the afternoon in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt to pull carrots, beets, and onions. Each vegetable was cleaned of earth by hand, their roots trimmed with a small knife and laid out on wooden racks to dry. This was a time of deep, quiet observation. You watched the way the light hit the tops of the maple trees, looking for that first single branch of bright orange that signaled the death of summer. The world was preparing to turn. The barns were being swept out to make room for the hay and corn, the rhythmic swish swish of the broom echoing in the empty lofts. The sense of urgency was low but steady. You lived in the middle time between the growth of summer and the harvest of autumn, a period of waiting and watching. As the sun set, you would sit on the porch, the wood still warm from the day's heat, and listen to the first few crickets of the evening. Their slower, cooler chirping replaced the frantic scream of the cicadas, a sonic clock ticking down the final days of 1777's warmth, the salt and the smoke, preparing the winter meat as the nights grew colder. The boring history of survival turned toward the preservation of meat. This was a process governed by salt and time. In the cool of the early morning, the salting troughs in the cellar were prepared. Great slabs of pork and beef were rubbed by hand with a mixture of coarse salt, brown sugar, and saltpeter. This wasn't a quick task. The salt had to be massaged into every fold and crevice of the meat to ensure it wouldn't rot in the months to come. Your hands would become cold and caked with the grainy mixture, the smell of raw meat and salt filling the damp air of the cellar. Once salted, the meat was packed into barrels, layered with more salt, and left to cure for weeks. The sound of the cellar was a heavy, wet silence, punctuated only by the slow dripping of brine. Later, the meat would be moved to the smokehouse, a small windowless tall building where a slow fire of hickory or apple wood was kept smoldering for days. You were the guardian of this fire. It couldn't be allowed to flame up, nor could it be allowed to go out. You would spend hours sitting on a stump outside the smokehouse door, watching the thin, blue ribbons of smoke seep through the cracks in the boards. This was the ultimate waiting game. The smoke infused the meat, turning it a deep, mahogany red, and ensuring that your family would have protein during the great white silence of February. It was a slow, aromatic alchemy that transformed the labor of the summer into the security of the winter. The groaning press and the river of Embers, late September 1777, settled over the colonies. The air took on a crisp, vinous quality. The scent of wood smoke was now a permanent guest, but it was joined by the sweet, fermenting aroma of crushed apples. This was the time of the cider press, a monumental wooden contraption that sat in the corner of the orchard or the barn like a silent, heavy god. For a colonial family, cider was not a treat. It was the primary source of hydration, safer than most well water and essential for the long winter. The process began with the gathering of the windfalls, the bruised and tart apples that had fallen in the night. You would spend the morning stooped over, your fingers stained dark by the tannins in the fruit, filling bushel baskets until your back felt like a rusted hinge. The pressing itself was a slow, mechanical ritual. The apples were first fed into a scratter, a hand cranked mill that chewed them into a wet, pulpy mass called pumice. This pulp was then layered between heavy sheets of burlap or straw, a process known as building the cheese. Once the stack was high enough, the great wooden screw of the press was turned. It required two men or a sturdy horse to rotate the lever. The sound was a symphony of groans, the wood of the press creaking under immense pressure, and the rhythmic drip dash splash of the amber liquid flowing into wooden tubs. You would stand there for hours, watching the slow, steady stream of juice, a liquid representation of a year's worth of sunshine and rain. It was a tedious, sticky, and exhausting labor, but the sight of the barrels filling up in the cellar provided a deep, quiet sense of fortification against the coming frost. The husking moon and the dust of the Barnby October, the great harvest, reached its peak with the arrival of the husking moon. The corn, which had stood like a wall of green in August, was now a rattling, golden skeleton. The stalks were cut by hand with a long knife and stacked into shocks that looked like tiny tepes across the fields. But the real labor happened in the barn. In the dim light of lanterns, the family and neighbors would gather for the husking. This was the quintessential, boring task of 1776, sitting on a pile of dried stalks for 6 hours a night, stripping away the papery layers to reveal the flinty, multicolored kernels beneath. The sound was a constant, dry shuck, 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 followed by the hollow thunk of the ear hitting the wooden floor. The air in the barn became thick with corn dust, which coated your eyelashes and made your throat feel like it was lined with wool. Your hands would become nicked and scratched by the sharp edges of the dried husks, and the repetitive motion of the wrist became a dull ache. Yet, there was a communal rhythm to it. Conversations were slow and sparse, often trailing off into the rhythmic sound of the work. You weren't just husking corn, you were stripping away the last remnants of the growing season, preparing the grain that would be ground into the daily, hasty pudding for the next 12 months. The barn, with its smell of dry hay and dust, became a sanctuary of productivity in a world that was rapidly turning cold and dark. The tallow dip and the infinite shadows as the days plummeted in length. The colonial home retreated into a world of flickering orange light. October was the month for the great dipping, the production of the year's supply of candles. This was a task that demanded a level of patience that would baffle the modern mind. A massive cauldron of tallow, rendered beef or mutton fat, was kept at a precise temperature over the fire. If it was too hot, the wax wouldn't cling. If it was too cool, it would lump. You would hold a brooch, a stick with 6 or 8 cotton wicks hanging from it, and dip it into the fat, down and up, down, and up. Between each dip, the candles had to cool and harden. You would walk a slow circle around the kitchen, waiting for the wax to set before the next dip. To make a single candle of useful thickness required over 30 dips. If a family needed 400 candles to survive the winter, the task stretched on for days. The house would smell of hot fat, a heavy, cloying scent that seemed to soak into the walls. Your eyes would grow weary from watching the thin layers of wax grow, a fraction of an inch at a time. This was the reality of 1776. If you wanted light in the darkness, you had to earn it through hours of standing, walking, and waiting. The shadows on the wall would grow and shrink with each pass of the candles, a ghostly dance that mirrored the slow, deliberate pace of your life. The final ceiling and the breath of the North. By late November, the boring history of 1777 reached its penultimate chapter, the ceiling of the home. The breath of the North began to rattle the window panes, and the first stray flakes of snow would dance in the gray light. You would spend the afternoon chinking the gaps between the logs or the foundation stones, using a mixture of mud, straw, and horsehair. You would meticulously fill every crack where the wind could whistle through. It was a cold, messy job, your fingers numbing as you pressed the wet mortar into the crevices. You also had to bank the house, piling dried leaves, pine boughs, or even dirt against the exterior base of the walls to insulate the floorboards from the freezing earth. Inside, the heavy wool tapestries, often just old blankets, were nailed over the doors and windows. The world was shrinking. The horizon, once miles away, was now just the edge of the woodpile. Every action was now focused on heat retention. The fire in the hearth was never allowed to die. Even at night, the largest backlog was placed at the rear of the fireplace to smolder until dawn. You lived in a state of constant, quiet vigilance, listening to the wind and feeling for drafts. The house had become a ship, and you were the crew battening down the hatches for a voyage through a sea of ice that would last until the following March.
The winter forge and the music of iron with the fields buried, and the livestock huddled in the dark warmth of the barn. The center of productivity shifted to the small forge, or the workbench in the shed. 1776 was a world of fix or do without. You would spend hours in the dim, smoky light of the forge heating old, rusted iron until it glowed a dull cherry red. The sound of the winter was the rhythmic, metallic tink-tink-tink of a small hammer shaping a new set of hinges or repairing broken plowshare. This was a slow, contemplative craft. You had to wait for the bellows to breathe life into the coals, wait for the iron to reach the perfect temperature, and then strike with precision before the metal cooled. The smell of the forge was a mixture of sulfur, hot iron, and charred leather. It was one of the few places of true heat in the winter, and you would linger there long after the work was done, soaking the warmth into your bones. Every nail you forged was a tiny monument to patience. To create a single pound of nails required hundreds of repetitive strikes and a steady, unblinking focus in the modern world. A nail is a trivial thing, but in 1777 it was an investment of an entire afternoon. This slow accumulation of hardware was what allowed a farm to survive the spring. As you worked, the sparks would fly into the dark corners of the shed, briefly illuminating the cobwebs and the frost-covered tools. A fleeting fire in the heart of the frozen season. The loom song and the fabric of time inside the house. The great wheel and the loom became the heartbeat of the winter. The production of cloth was an infinite, rhythmic cycle that defined the female experience of 1776. You would stand at the spinning wheel for hours, your body swaying back and forth, in a motion so practiced it became unconscious. The whirl of the wheel was the white noise of the colonial night. To spin enough yarn for a single wool blanket required walking nearly 20 miles beside the wheel. It was a journey taken in place, a trek through the landscape of your own thoughts. Then came the loom. The wooden frame would groan as the batten was pulled forward to seat the thread. Clack thud, clack thud. Each row of weaving added only a fraction of an inch to the cloth. You would watch the pattern emerge with agonizing slowness, a simple checked linen, or a heavy coverlet for the beds. The repetition was hypnotic, a way to measure the passage of the long, dark months. There was no fast fashion. Every garment worn by the family was a physical manifestation of hundreds of hours of human life. As the shuttle flew back and forth, you were weaving the very history of your family into the fabric. The cloth was heavy, honest, and meant to last for decades. A testament to a world where time was the most abundant resource and labor was the only currency. The ledger of the year and the dying Kinleys, the final nights of the year approached. The head of the house would sit at the small oak desk, a single tallow candle guttering in the draft. This was the time for the annual account, using a goose quill pen that had to be periodically sharpened with a small knife. You would record the year's gains and losses in a leather-bound ledger. The scratching of the nib on the rough paper was the only sound in the room. 4 bushels of wheat sold, 6 pounds of salt purchased, 3 sheep lost to the winter fever. This was not just financial accounting, it was a reckoning of survival. You looked at the ink-stained pages and saw the story of 1776, the sweat of the July harvest, the cold of the March planting, and the silence of the December snow. The candle would burn down, the flame dancing as it reached the bottom of the stick, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. You would sand the wet ink, close the book, and sit for a moment in the total darkness. The year was ending, but the cycle remained. Outside, the wind would howl against the logs, but inside, the hearth was banked with ash. The larder was full, and the family was asleep. You had survived another turn of the earth. The boring history was the greatest victory of all, the quiet, steady persistence of life against the vast, cold indifference of the wilderness. The thaw's deception and the breaking of the river as the calendar shifted deeper. Into the early months of 1778, the colonial world entered a state of the Great Deception. A stray day of warmth would arrive, the sun feeling unnaturally hot against the snow, causing a premature softening of the world. This was the most dangerous time for the farm. You would spend the afternoon walking the perimeter of your land, listening for the sound of the river. The ice, once a solid and silent highway, would begin to groan and pop, a sound like distant cannon fire echoing through the valley. This was ice out, a slow-motion cataclysm where massive cakes of frozen water would heave and grind against each other, threatening to sweep away any bridge or mill dam built too close to the banks you would stand on. The muddy bank, a heavy, iron-pure Y-bar in hand, watching the white flows move with a terrifying, silent momentum. If the ice jammed, the water would rise in minutes, flooding the lower barns. The labor was one of constant vigilance. You would spend hours in the biting slush, clearing debris and pushing at smaller ice chunks to keep the flow moving. There was no mechanical help. There was only the leverage of wood and iron against the raw power of the changing season. The air smelled of wet earth and ancient frozen rot. It was a time of immense tension hidden behind a mask of boring observation, waiting for the river to finally run clear so the true work of the spring could begin. The blacksmith's breath and the renewal of the edge with the field still too wet to plow. The farm's focus turned to the renewal of the edge. Every tool that had been dulled by the previous year's harvest or the winter's wood cutting had to be brought to the grindstone. The stone itself was a massive circular slab of grit, mounted on a wooden frame and turned by a foot treadle. The sound was a long, rhythmic shriek, accompanied by a spray of cold water to keep the steel from losing its temper. You would sit there for an entire afternoon, your leg pumping the treadle in a steady, hypnotic beat while you held the axe head or the scythe blade against the spinning stone. The sparks would fly in a golden arc, smelling of hot metal and wet rock. This was a task of extreme patience and physical repetition. You had to feel the burr of the metal with your thumb, checking the angle of the edge 1,000 times, until it was sharp enough to shave the hair from your arm. A dull tool was a danger and a drain on energy. A sharp tool was a silent partner in the coming struggle with the soil. By the end of the day, your leg would be numb from the treadle and your hands would be stained with a mixture of iron, filings in water, but the row of gleaming silver edges leaning against the barn wall provided a deep sense of readiness. The tools were the extension of your will, and their sharpness was the only thing that stood between you and a failed crop. The preparation of the seed and the hope of the vine in the dark, cool corners of the loft, the most important ritual of the late winter took place, the winnowing of the seed. You would spend days sitting on a wooden stool, surrounded by sacks of grain saved from the previous year. This was the bridge between the past and the future. Each handful of seed was poured slowly from one basket to another in a gentle draft of air, allowing the light chaff and dust to blow away while the heavy, viable grain fell back into the container. The sound was a soft, dry hush like the breath of the earth itself. You would then spread the grain out on a clean sheet and pick through it by hand, removing any cracked kernels or tiny stones. It was a task that required the focus of a jeweler and the patience of a saint. As you worked, you would think about the lineage of this grain, how it had been brought across the ocean by your grandfather or traded for with a neighbor 3 towns away. This was not just food, it was a genetic memory of survival. You were the guardian of the next generation of life. The rhythmic motion of your hands, the dusty smell of the grain, and the low light of the afternoon combined to create a sense of timelessness. You were doing exactly what humans had done for 10,000 years, a quiet, boring act of faith that ensured the world would continue to turn one seed at a time. The final ash and the turning of the key as the script of 1777 finally closes, and the first true green of 1778 appears in the sheltered hollows. The colonial story reaches its ultimate quiet point. The last of the winter's heavy logs is burned down to a fine white ash. This ash is not wasted. It is gathered and carried to the garden to sweeten the soil, completing the circle of the hearth. You stand in the doorway of the house looking out over the land that has been your world for another year. The silence of the winter is gone, replaced by the soft, chaotic chatter of birds and the distant, rhythmic clop of a horse on the now firm road. You turn the heavy iron key in the lock not to keep people out, but to seal the history of the year inside. The house is a vessel of memories, the smell of the summer jam, the sound of the winter loom, the weight of the autumn harvest. You have lived through the boring history of a nation's birth, but your victory was not in the battles, it was in the persistence. You have maintained the fire, fed the family, and kept the forest at bay. As you walk out into the fresh spring air, the sun feels different on your skin, stronger, more urgent. The epic is over, yet it is also just beginning. The cycle is eternal. As you draw a deep breath of the new year, you realize that the profound parts of life are found in the quiet, repetitive moments that no history book ever bothers to record. The awakening of the hive and the vernal rhythm as the sun gained strength in the spring of 1778. Another silent inhabitant of the colonial farm began its slow, methodical awakening, the honeybees. In 1776, a farm without bees was a farm without sweetness or the means to seal 1,000 tiny leaks. You would walk out to the bee-kept stone baskets made of twisted straw and listen. The silence of winter was replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. This was the first flight where the bees emerged to find the very first willow catkins. Your task was to inspect the skeps for damage from winter mice or dampness. It was a slow, careful labor, moving with deliberate stillness so as not to agitate the drowsy colony. The smell of old wax and cold honey hung in the air. If a hive had perished, you would spend the afternoon meticulously melting down the honeycomb in a pot of simmering water, process that filled the yard with a heavy floral scent. The wax was strained through a cloth, cooling into solid yellow cakes that would later be used to waterproof thread or lubricate the wooden tracks of the barn doors. Life was a series of these small, unhurried harvests. Nothing was wasted, and every creature played its part in the farm's survival. The rhythms of the fence and the vernal boundary before first seeds could be entrusted to the earth, the boundary walk had to be completed. Every winter, the frost and the wind conspired to pull down the worm fences, the zigzagging structures of split cedar rails that protected the crops from wandering livestock. You would spend days walking the miles of perimeter, a heavy wooden mallet in one hand and a bundle of fresh-cut stakes in the other. This was the ultimate repetitive labor, lifting the heavy, weather-grayed rails, clearing away the rotted leaves at the base, and resetting the zigzag to ensure it was hog-tight and bull-strong. the sound of the mallet striking the stakes a hollow. Wooden thud dash thud echoed across the quiet valleys. There was no rush. You measured your progress by the length of the shadows. As you worked, you would find the small signs of the changing year, a patch of pale green moss, a cluster of early spring beauties, or the tracks of a fox in the drying mud. Your hands became rough and stained by the tannins of the cedar, and your shoulders grew accustomed to the weight of the rails. This was the boring history of property and protection. A well-built fence was a silent contract with your neighbors, and a shield for your family's future. By the time the sun dipped low, your body felt the honest ache of the land, a physical connection to the borders of your world. The sowing of the flax and the promise of the thread in the final days of this journey, we turned to the blue field, the planting of the flax. Flax was the foundation of the colonial wardrobe, the plant that would eventually become the cool linen of your summer shirts. The seed was tiny and slippery, like dark droplets of water. You would stand at the edge of a finely harrowed field, a linen bag slung over your shoulder, and begin the broadcasting. This was a rhythmic, sweeping motion of the arm, timed perfectly with your stride. Step, swing, scatter, step, swing. Scattered out, the seeds fell in a near-invisible mist, settling into the dark, moist furrows. It was a task that required a calm mind and a steady pace. If you moved too fast, the crop would be crowded too slow, and the weeds would take over. The air was cool and smelled of tilled loam and the distant sea. This was the quietest moment. The agricultural year, the heartbeat between the preparation and the growth. Once the field was sown, you would drag a bush harrow, a bundle of birch branches over the soil to lightly cover the seeds. The sound was a soft, continuous shh, like the world itself was being lulled to sleep. As the twilight deepened and the first bats began to flicker against the violet sky, you would look back at the smooth, dark field, knowing that beneath the surface, the miracle of 1778 was already beginning its slow, silent ascent. The awakening of the creek and the grind of the mill as the spring of 1778 deepened. The rising waters of the melt-off brought life to the most important mechanical heart of the community. The grist mill. During the winter, the giant wooden water wheel had been locked in ice, silent and skeletal. Now, with the creek roaring and white with foam, Miller began the slow process of dressing the stones. This was a task of extreme precision and incredible monotony. You would spend the entire morning sitting on a low bench using a mill pick, a small, sharp hammer to chip away at the grooves of the massive granite millstones. The sound was a constant, metallic clink, clink, clink that echoed off the damp stone walls of the mill. Every groove had to be sharpened to ensure the grain was ground into fine flour rather than crushed into a paste. The air inside the mill was cool and smelled of damp moss and old, dusty grain. This was the boring history of the town's bread. Once the stones were set, the sluice gate was open. The heavy wooden gears began to groan and creak, a slow, rhythmic thumper that felt like the heartbeat of the valley returning. You would watch the first kernels of saved corn disappear into the hopper, emerging as a warm, golden dust that smelled of the previous summer's sun, the slow boil of the spring tonic after the long, vitamin-deprived months of winter. The colonial body felt heavy and sluggish. The solution was the spring tonic, a process of foraging and boiling that took up many a quiet afternoon. You would wander through the meadows looking for the first bitter greens, dandelion, dock, and burdock root. This was a silent, stooping labor. You would move slowly across the grass, your eyes fixed on the small bursts of green, filling your apron with the pungent weeds. Back at the house, a large iron pot was filled with spring water and the gathered greens. The liquid had to simmer for hours over a low fire, turning a dark, earthy brown. The smell was sharp and medicinal, filling the kitchen and clinging to the curtains. There was no medicine cabinet. There was only the slow, rhythmic stirring of the pot and the belief in the earth's ability to heal the winter's damage. You would sit by the fire, watching the steam rise in thin, lazy spirals, listening to the wood snap as it burned down to coals. This was a time of internal cleansing, a quiet ritual that prepared the spirit for the grueling labor of the coming planting season. The whitewashing and the restoration of light inside the timber house, the walls had become stained by a winter's worth of soot from the hearth and smoke from the tallow candles. To restore the light, the annual whitewashing began. This was a simple but endless task. You would mix quicklime and water in a large bucket, stirring it with a long stick until it became a thick, milky white liquid. Using a brush made of coarse pig bristles, you would apply the mixture to the dark wooden beams in the stone fireplace. The movement was repetitive: dip, stroke, stroke, dip, stroke, stroke. As the lime dried, it transformed from a dull gray to a brilliant, chalky white that seemed to suck the daylight into the room. This was the boring history of cleanliness. The smell was sharp and clean, like wet stone. You would move from room to room, your arms aching from the overhead work, watching the shadows flee as the walls brightened. It was a slow reclamation of the home from the grime of survival. By the time the sun set, the house felt larger and more hopeful, a clean slate for the year 1778, ready to catch the first golden rays of the spring dawn. The mending of the nets and the river's bounty for those living near the coast or the great rivers. Spring brought the run, the arrival of shad and alewives by the thousands. But before a single fish could be caught, the mending of the nets had to be completed. This was a task of infinite knots. You would sit on the porch in the warming sun, a wooden knitting needle in your hand, working through yards of hemp twine. Every tear from the previous year's rocks or debris had to be found and repaired. The sound was the rhythmic snip of the knife and the soft zip of the twine. As the needle flew through the mesh, it was a meditative process, a way to occupy the hands while the mind drifted with the clouds. You would spend days in this state of quiet industry, the sun tanning the back of your hands and the salt air bringing a tang of the ocean to your lips. The nets were the webs of survival, a delicate architecture designed to harvest the energy of the river. As you finished the last knot and folded the heavy, rough twine into a basket, you felt a sense of completion. The tools were ready, the river was rising, the cycle was turning once again, moving from the stillness of the hearth to the motion of the water. The planting of the three sisters in the sacred mound as May 1778 warmed the soil. To the depth of a man's hand, the most essential planting ritual began. The three sisters. This was a technique learned from the indigenous peoples, a perfect, slow-motion symbiosis of corn, beans, and squash. It began with the creation of the mounds. You would move across the tilled field with a heavy iron hoe, pulling the dark, loamy earth into small hillocks, each spaced exactly one long stride apart. This was a rhythmic, grounding labor: strike, pull, step, strike, pull, step. In the center of each mound, you would poke a hole with your thumb and drop in for kernels of flint corn. Once the corn reached the height of a finger, you would return to plant the pole beans and the squash seeds. The beans would climb the corn stalks. The corn would provide the structure, and the large squash leaves would shade the ground, acting as a living mulch to keep the moisture in the earth. This was the boring history of agricultural wisdom. You would spend days in the field, your back bent, moving in a slow dance with the soil. The sun would beat down on your wide-brimmed felt hat, and the only sound was the dry rustle of the seed bag and the occasional call of a red-winged blackbird. It was a task of infinite repetition, but within those mounds lay the entire food security of the coming winter. The shearing of the garden and the herb lore while the main fields were being sown. The kitchen garden required a different kind of meticulous care. This was the domain of the simples, the herbs used for flavoring, fragrance, and medicine. You would spend the afternoon kneeling in the dirt, thinning the rows of sage, thyme, rosemary, and lavender. This was a sensory labor. As your hands brushed against the plants, the air would fill with a thick, herbal perfume that clung to your skin and clothes. Each herb had to be harvested at the precise moment before it flowered. You would use a small, sharp pair of snips to take the cuttings, laying them carefully in a flat wicker basket. The boring history of the garden was a study in patience and observation. Back in the house, these bundles were tied with twine and hung from the rafters of the kitchen to dry. Over the weeks, they would shrink and darken, their scents intensifying until the entire room smelled like a dried meadow. These herbs were the tiny luxuries of 1776, the flavors that made the endless cornmeal mush bearable and the infusions that calmed a cough. In the middle of a January night, the midnight vigil and the protection of the fold in the late spring as the new lambs and calves were born, the boring history of 1778 took on a nocturnal rhythm. The threat of predators, wolves, and bears was a constant low-level anxiety. To protect the vulnerable young livestock, you would often pull the night watch. This involved sitting in the doorway of the barn or by a small, controlled fire near the fold, draped in a heavy wool cloak against the damp night air. The The silence of a colonial night was thick and absolute. You would sit for hours, your only company being the rhythmic chewing of the cows and the occasional baa of a lamb. Your ears would become hyper-attuned to the sounds of the woods, the snap of a dry twig, the hoot of a barred owl, or the rustle of the wind in the new leaves. There were no lights except for the stars and the glowing orange heart of your small fire. This was a time of profound isolation and stillness. You weren't doing anything, yet you were performing the most vital task of all, being a presence. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, you would feel a deep, weary satisfaction. The fold was safe. The cycle of life had continued through the night, protected by your silent, steady vigil. The repair of the sleigh and the memory of ice even as the world turned green. The colonial mind was always looking 6 months ahead in the cool shade of the barn. You would spend a rainy afternoon in June working on the winter sleigh. This was the season for maintenance, where the heavy oak runners were inspected for cracks and the iron shoes were greased to prevent rust. It felt strange to handle the tools of winter while the bumblebees buzzed in the clover outside. But in 1776, lack of preparation was a death sentence. The work was slow and methodical. You would use a draw knife to shave down a new piece of hickory for a broken strut, the long wooden curls falling to the floor like shavings of pale gold. The smell of wood shavings, old leather, and horse manure created a nostalgic atmosphere. You worked with a steady, unhurried pace, the shuck-shuck of the knife being the only sound against the steady patter of the rain on the shingled roof. By maintaining the sleigh in the heat of summer, you were acknowledging the inevitable return of the cold. It was a boring act of foresight, a quiet understanding that life in the colonies was a continuous loop of preparation, labor, and survival. First berry moon and the stoop labor bee mid-June 1778. The meadows of the colonies were transformed by the arrival of the first berry moon. Wild strawberries, tiny and intensely sweet, began to ripen low in the tall grass. This was a harvest that required a specific kind of physical humility to gather enough for a single meal. You had to spend the entire afternoon in a state of constant stooping or kneeling, moving inch by inch through the meadow. The sun would bake the back of your neck as you parted the stems of timothy and clover to find the hidden red gems. The sound of the afternoon was the dry rustle of the grass against your breeches and the distant, rhythmic tonk-tonk of a cowbell. Your fingers would become stained a deep, indelible crimson, and the sweet, slightly fermented scent of crushed berries would rise from the earth. This was the boring history of sweetness. There were no shortcuts. You couldn't stand up to pick, and you couldn't rush the ripening. You simply moved with the slow, grazing pace of a deer, filling your cedar bark basket one tiny berry at a time, until the shadows of the elms stretched long across the field, and the first evening primrose began to open the great scything end. The geometry of the field as June bled into July. The great scything began the most visually iconic and physically demanding rhythmic labor of the 18th century, when the timothy and orchard grass reached the height of your knee and began to go to seed. The entire community shifted into the fields. The tool was the long-handled scythe, blade of tempered steel that required a perfect circular motion. The torso, you would stand at the edge of the field at dawn, the dew still heavy on the grass. The movement was a low, sweeping arc swing, step, swing. The sound was a crisp, rhythmic swish as the blade sliced through the stalks. If three and worked together, they moved in a staggered line, their motion synchronized to avoid the swing of the man behind them. It was a dance of immense power and extreme repetition. The air was thick with the scent of mown hay, a smell that, to a colonial farmer, meant life itself. By midday, the heat would be shimmering off the stubble and the water in your wooden keg would be lukewarm, but the rhythm never faltered. You were carving the winter's survival out of the earth, one silver sweep at a time. The drying winds and the titting of the hands, the grass was cut. It couldn't simply be gathered. It had to be tedded or turned to dry in the sun. This was a task for the lighter wooden forks, and it required a constant flicking motion of the wrists. You would spend the afternoon walking the rows of fallen grass, tossing it into the air to let the breeze move through the stalks. The boring history of haymaking was a weather-watching game. You would glance at the horizon every few minutes, looking for the thunderheads that could ruin a week's work in 10 minutes. The sound of the hayfield was the dry, scratching noise of the wooden tines against the stalks and the constant, high-pitched cheep of grasshoppers displaced by the work as the hay dried. It turned from a vibrant green to a pale, sun-bleached tan, becoming lighter and more fragrant. This was the slow alchemy of the summer turning rain and soil into the fuel that would keep the oxen pulling through the snows of the coming January. The quietude of the midsummer hearth in the height of July. The great indoor hearth of the house finally went quiet, save for a few glowing coals kept alive for cooking. The keeping room, usually the center of warmth, became a cool, shaded sanctuary. You would spend the hottest part of the day indoors, the heavy timber walls acting as a natural insulator. This was the time for the small repairs, the tasks that required sitting still. You might spend 3 hours sitting on a bench using bone needle to repair a tear in a grain sack or carving a new wooden peg for a loose chair leg. The house was filled with a sleepy, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the tall case clock and the occasional buzz of a fly against the window pane. There was no pressure to be productive in the modern sense. There was only the steady, unhurried maintenance of a life. You moved at the pace of the shadows crawling across the floorboards as the sun began to set. The air outside would finally cool, and you would emerge from the house like a creature from a burrow, ready for the final chores of the evening under a sky the color of a bruised plum. Rising dust of the threshing floor as the late summer of 1778 approached. The rhythm of the farm moved from the open meadows into the shaded, dusty interior of the threshing barn. The winter wheat harvested and dried now sat in heavy bundles. To unlock the grain from the stalk, you performed the most rhythmic and repetitive labor of the season, flailing. The tool was a flail, heavy sticks of hickory or ash joined by a stout leather thong. You would stand on the threshing floor, usually located in the center of the barn where the cross breeze was strongest, with a steady overhead swing. You brought the flail down onto the grain with a hollow thumb crack. The motion was hypnotic. Lift, swing, strike, lift, swing, strike. For hours, the only sound was the rhythmic beating of the wood against the stalks and the soft rustle of the straw. As you worked, a fine golden dust rose from the floor, coating your hair and filling your lungs with the scent of dry earth and toasted grain. This was the boring history of the daily loaf. You moved in a circle, turning the wheat with a wooden fork and beating it again, until the heavy kernels were finally shaken loose from their husks, settling into the cracks of the floorboards like tiny golden prayers. The winnowing breeze and the gravity of grainings, the threshing was complete. Grain was mixed with a mountain of useless chaff and broken straw to separate them. You waited for a day with a steady, fair breeze. You would stand in the wide open barn doors holding a shallow winnowing basket filled with the mixture. With a practiced flick of the wrists, you would toss the grain into the air. The physics were simple but required perfect timing. The light chaff would be caught by the breeze and carried out into the yard, while the heavy, dense grain would fall straight back into the basket with a soft, metallic hiss. This was a task of absolute focus. If you tossed high, the grain would scatter to low, and the chaff would remain. You would repeat this motion hundreds of times, your arms burning from the weight until the basket held nothing but pure, clean wheat. The yard outside would become covered in a fine layer of golden husks, a bounty of the wind, while the grain was carefully funneled into heavy linen sacks. It was a slow, dusty, and silent victory, ensuring that the grist mill would have work and the family would have bread through the coming winter. The dipping of the tallow and the preservation of light in the cooling evenings of late August. The focus returned to the light of the home. The summer's accumulation of animal fats, beef tallow, and mutton fat had been rendered down into a large, heavy cauldron. This was the season of the second dipping. You would spend the entire evening by the dying fire, dipping the cotton wicks into the melted fat. This was the ultimate exercise in patience. Each dip added a layer of wax no thicker than a blade of grass. You would walk a slow, repetitive circle, dip the frame, hang it to cool, move to the next. House smelled of hot fat and wood smoke, a heavy cloying scent that signaled the approach. The dark months, there were no shortcuts to create a single hour of light for a January night. You had to invest 10 minutes of standing and waiting in August. You watched the candles grow with agonizing slowness, their pale, translucent bodies thickening with every pass. By the time the final candle was finished and stored in the wooden candle box, the fire would be nothing but glowing embers, and the silence of the colonial night would be absolute. The mending of the harness and the oil of the earth as the dog days reached their peak. The physical labor in the fields often became too intense for the midday sun, you would retreat to the cool, shaded tack room of the barn to perform the mending of the leather every harness, bridle, and strap that pulled the plows and wagons had been strained by the summer's work. You would sit on a low stitching pony, a wooden vise used to hold the leather and work with a cobbler's awl and waxed linen thread. The sound was the rhythmic pop of the awl piercing the thick cowhide and the long, slow zip of the thread being pulled through. You would rub the leather with neats, foot oil, or animal grease to keep it supple, the dark liquid soaking into your own skin. This was a task of tactile intimacy. You knew every crack and wear mark in the harness, just as you knew the temperament of the horse that wore it. The work was slow, oily, and quiet. You moved with the unhurried pace of someone who knew that a broken strap in the middle of a harvest was a disaster as you worked. The smell of old leather and oil combined with the dry scent of the hayloft, creating a sensory bubble of productivity while the world outside shimmered in the relentless heat. First frost watch and the vigil of the Vinesby, the end of August 1778. A new rhythm entered the colonial night, the frost watch. After the sweltering heat of the dog days, a sudden, sharp clarity would occasionally settle over the evening sky. The stars would appear unnaturally bright, and the wind would die down to a haunting stillness. This was the signal that a killing frost might descend, threatening the late summer squash and the ripening pumpkins. You would spend the twilight hours moving through the kitchen garden, with heavy mats made of woven straw or old, threadbare blankets. This was a slow, protective labor draping the vines with the care of a parent tucking in a child. The squash leaves, large and sandpaper rough, would rustle against the fabric. There was no way to save the entire field, so you focused on the seed producers, the finest specimens that would provide the life for next year's garden. The air felt thin and brittle, smelling of dry grass and the first hint of wood smoke from the neighbors' chimneys. This was the boring history of anxiety. You were waiting for an invisible enemy armed only with straw and patience, watching the thermometer if you had one, or simply feeling the bite of the air on your knuckles. The curing of the gourd in the autumn portions, the danger of the first frost had passed and the vines began to wither. The curing began. This was a season of heavy orange geometry. You would spend the afternoon hauling the pumpkins and hard-shelled squashes from the field to the porch or the south-facing wall of the barn. Each one had to be handled with care. A single bruise in the rind would lead to rot in the cellar by December. You would sit on a wooden bench, using a piece of burlap to wipe the damp earth and field dust from each gourd. This was a repetitive, tactile task, feeling the ridges and the weight of the harvest. Pumpkins were laid out in the sun to harden off, a process that thickened the skin into a natural armor. The porch became a sea of orange and deep green, a visual representation of the calories stored for the winter. The sound of the afternoon was the occasional thud of a pumpkin being set down and the dry, papery rattle of the dying corn shocks nearby. You moved with a slow, heavy grace, your muscles accustomed to the weight, knowing that each one you cleaned was another week of safety for your family. The cider boil and the reduction of time with the cider barrels full in the cellar, the colonial kitchen took on a new, sweet, and sticky occupation, the cider boil. This was the process of reducing fresh apple juice into boiled cider or apple molasses, a thick, dark syrup that would last for years without fermenting. You would fill a massive copper cauldron often holding 30 gallons and hang it over a steady, low fire. This was the ultimate test of endurance to prevent the sugar from burning. The cider had to be stirred constantly for 12 to 15 hours. You would take turns with the rest of the family, standing by the heat with a long-handled wooden paddle. The movement was a slow, figure-8 motion through the steaming liquid. As the hours passed, the bright, tart scent of fresh apples transformed into a deep, caramelized aroma that soaked into your skin and hair. The volume of the liquid would drop inch by inch, until only a fraction of the original juice remained, a potent mahogany-colored essence. The boring history of the cider boil was a journey through the steam, a day lived in a golden, scented haze while the world outside turned steadily toward the gray of November. The winter woodpile and the architecture of warmth as the final leaves of 1778 began to drift from the maples. The great stacking began. The wood that had been felled in the previous winter and split in the spring was now dry enough to be moved to the woodshed or stacked against the house. This was the most essential geometry of survival. You would move the logs one by one, or in a small wheelbarrow, stacking them in tight, overlapping rows. This was a task of rhythmic, physical meditation. You had to choose each log for its shape, flat ones for the base, split ones for the core to ensure the stack wouldn't collapse. Under the weight of the coming snow, the sound was a rhythmic clack, clack, clack of wood hitting wood. The smell was the clean, sharp scent of dried oak and the earthy aroma of the moss that had grown on the bark. A cord of wood was a measurement of time. One cord might last a month. A full winter required 20. You looked at the rising wall of wood and saw not just fuel, but the very hours of your life. As the stack grew higher than your head, the house felt more secure, the wood acting as a secondary skin against the north wind. By the time the final log was placed, the sun was a cold, pale disk in the sky, and you stood back to survey your work, a solid, silent barricade against the coming white silence. The great carding and the rhythms of the wool as the first true blizzard of December 1778 sealed the cracks in the cabin walls with a pack of ice. The work of the farm moved inward toward the warmth of the hearth. This was the season of the great carding. The raw wool that had been sheared, washed, and dried in the summer was now a tangled, oily mass of fibers. To prepare it for spinning, it had to be carded, brushed repeatedly between two wooden paddles covered in fine wire teeth. You would sit on a low stool by the fire, the only sound being the rhythmic scroot, scroot, scroot of the wire teeth pulling through the wool. This was a task of immense repetition. You would place a small tuft of wool on one card and brush it with the other over and over, until the fibers were aligned into a soft, airy roll called a roll lag. Each roll lag took several minutes of focused, manual labor. The lanolin from the wool would soak into your skin, making your hands supple despite the biting cold of the room beyond the fire's reach. For hours you would sit in a semi-trance, the firelight dancing on the walls, producing pile after pile of these cloud-like rolls, knowing that each one represented a few more inches of the yarn that would eventually become a winter cloak, the sallow light and the winter mending in the deep midwinter. The boring history of 1778 was measured by the length of a single tallow candle. When the sun set at 4 in the afternoon, the world became a sphere of flickering orange light. This was the time for the winter mending, not of cloth, but of the wooden and iron bones of the farm. You would bring your smaller tools, chisels, augers, and planes to the hearthside to be cleaned and oiled out using a small rag dipped in rendered fat. You would rub the wooden handles until they glowed with a deep, honey-colored patina. You would inspect the iron heads for the slightest hint of rust, scraping it away with a bit of sandstone. This was a silent, tactile conversation with the objects that allowed you to survive. You knew every nick in the blade of your draw knife and every knot in the handle of your mallet. The work was slow and quiet, the only interruptions being the occasional snap of a log in the fireplace, or the moan of the wind in the chimney. By maintaining these tools in the dark months, you were ensuring that when the first thaw arrived, you would be ready to strike the earth without delay. The salt pork stew and the monotony of the pot beat January. The culinary life of the colonial home had contracted into a single, heavy iron pot that hung perpetually over the fire. This was the season of the infinite stew. The fresh vegetables of summer were a distant memory, replaced by the salted, dried, and stored staples of the cellar. Each morning, you would go down into the cool darkness of the cellar to retrieve a hunk of salt pork from its brine barrel and a handful of shriveled leather breeches, dried green beans. Closing parenthesis. The preparation was a slow, daily ritual. The salt pork had to be soaked to remove the excess salt, then diced and tossed into the pot with whatever root vegetables remained, usually parsnips or rutabagas. Pot would simmer all day, the thick, savory steam filling the house. The sound was a low, constant bubble pop that underscored every other activity. Dinner was the same as lunch, which was the same as the dinner before it. This monotony was not a sign of poverty, but of a stable, predictable survival. You ate slowly, savoring the warmth more than the flavor. The wooden spoon scraping rhythmically against the bottom of the bowl in a house felt like a fortress against the white, frozen silence outside. The banking of the hearth and the final act of every winter day in 1778 was the banking of the fire. This was the most critical responsibility of the household, for to let the fire die was to wake up in a house of ice, As the family climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft, you would stay behind to tend the embers. You would use a long iron shovel to push the glowing coals to the back of the fireplace, then cover them with a thick, insulating layer of gray ash. This act of baking preserved the heat, allowing the coals to smolder slowly until morning. You would stand there for a moment in the deepening gloom, the smell of wood smoke and old stone heavy in the air. The house was settling, the timbers groaning as they cooled. You could hear the muffled breathing of your family above you in the distant, lonely howl of a wolf in the timber. This was the quietest moment of the boring history, the heartbeat. Between one day of labor and the next, you would blow out the final candle, the wick glowing red for a second before vanishing into blackness, and find your way to bed by the faint, ghostly light of the snow reflecting through the window. The cycle of 1778 was complete, and the long, slow wait for the spring of 1779 had begun.
The first tap of the maple and the song of the spile. As the calendar turned toward March 1780, the great thaw freeze began. The days were warm enough to make the eaves drip, while the nights remained bitter and cold. This was the precise pulse required for the maple sap to run. You would head into the sugar bush, the stand of ancient maples on the north ridge, carrying a hand auger and a bundle of elderberry spiles. The labor was a study in gentle, repetitive percussion. You would choose a tree, lean your weight into the auger and turn. Squeak, grind, squeak, grind. The bit would bite into the wood, releasing a small spray of pale shavings. As soon as the hole was deep enough, you tapped the hollow spile into place with a wooden mallet. Tink, tink, thud. Then the silence of the woods would be broken by the most hopeful sound of the year, the first ping of a crystal-clear drop of sap hitting the bottom of an empty wooden bucket. You moved from tree to tree, repeating this ritual 100 times, until the woods were filled with a chaotic, metallic symphony of dripping sap, the heartbeat of the new year finally beginning to throb. The boiling down, and the wall of steam once, the buckets were full. The boring history of the sugar season moved to the boiling arch, a long, low structure of stone that held massive iron kettles. For the next 2 weeks, your life would be lived entirely within a cloud of sweet-smelling steam. It took nearly 40 gallons of sap to produce a single gallon of syrup, which meant the fires had to be kept roaring 24 hours a day. Your task was the long stir. You stood by the kettles with a long-handled wooden paddle, moving the liquid in a constant, slow-motion figure 8 to prevent the sugar from scorching. The steam would coat your face, dampening your hair and making your clothes heavy with moisture. The sound was a continuous, low-level bubble hiss, underscored by the crackle of the hardwood fire beneath. You lived in a world of white mist, where the only thing that mattered was the thickness of the liquid. As the sap reduced, it turned from clear water to a pale gold, then to a deep mahogany amber. This was the boring history of sweetness, a total immersion in heat and vapor, waiting for the exact moment when the water vanished and the essence remained. The sugar off and the grain of the year eyes. The syrup reached its final density. The sugar off began. To save space and prevent spoilage, most of the crop was boiled further until it crystallized into maple sugar. This required a level of focus that bordered on the spiritual. You had to stir the thickening mass with a heavy wooden spoon, feeling the resistance change as the liquid turned to a gritty paste. The sound was a heavy, wet slap, slap, slap of the spoon against the iron pot. This was the most physically demanding part of the process. Your forearms would ache, and the heat from the pot would turn your skin a bright, glowing red. Finally, the sugar was poured into wooden molds, small hearts, stars, or simple blocks. As it cooled, it turned into a hard, grainy treasure that would be the family's only source of sweetness for the rest of 1780. You would sit in the sugar shack, exhausted and sticky, watching the steam finally dissipate as the fires were allowed to die. The boring history of the maple was complete, leaving behind a row of solid brown blocks that tasted of the very soul of the woods. The pulling of the spiles and the closing of the woundas. The buds on the trees began to swell. The sap turned buddy and bitter, signaling the end of the season. The final task was the closing. You walked the ridge once more, this time with a heavy pair of iron pincers to pull the spiles. This was a slow, rhythmic extraction. Grip, pull, twist. Each hole was then plugged with a small wooden peg, or a dab of clay to protect the tree from insects. The woods were returning to their natural silence. The pinging was gone, replaced by the soft, muddy squelch of your boots in the thawing earth. You would spend the rest of the day hauling the heavy iron kettles back to the barn to be greased and stored. The sugar season was a bridge. It provided the first income and the first sweetness of the year. But its end meant the arrival of the truly grueling work, the plowing of 1780. You stood at the edge of the woods, the smell of damp earth and old snow in your nostrils, looking down at the brown fields and realizing that the boring history of the soil was about to begin all over again. The first furrow and the iron songs. The frost finally surrendered to the persistent April sun of 1780. The fields transitioned from a frozen wasteland to a sea of heavy, dark loam. This was the moment of the first furrow. You would lead the team of oxen, their breath still visible in the cool morning air, to the edge of the south field. The plow, with its freshly scoured iron share, sat waiting. This was the most physically demanding, boring history of the spring. The moment where human, animal, and earth collided. The labor was a study in balanced tension. You had to lean your weight against the plow handles, digging the blade into the sod while guiding the oxen with rhythmic, guttural commands. Haw, gee. The sound was a deep, tearing rip crunch as the iron sliced through the roots of last year's weeds and rolled the heavy soil over into a dark, glistening ribbon. You moved at a pace of 2 miles per hour, your boots sinking into the fresh-turned earth with every step. For hours, you watched the blade, focused on keeping the furrow as straight as a taut string. A crooked furrow was a sign of a distracted mind, and in 1780, focus was the only thing that ensured a clean planting. The mending of the harness and the oil of labor. After a day in the fields, the leather harnesses that bound the oxen to the plow would be caked with sweat, salt, and mud to prevent the leather from cracking or galling the animal's skin. The evening oil was mandatory. You would sit on a stump in the barn, a rag in one hand, and a tin of neat's foot oil in the other. This was a slow, tactile ritual of maintenance. The sound was a soft hiss-rub of cloth on leather. You had to work the oil into every strap, bucklehole, and seam, feeling for any fraying that could lead to a snap in the middle of a workday. The smell was a pungent mix of animal musk and the heavy, nutty aroma of the oil. This was the boring history of the gear. You weren't just cleaning. You were preserving the connection between your power and the plow. As the leather softened under your fingers, turning from a dry, dusty gray to a deep, lustrous black, you felt the satisfaction of a tool well cared for. It was a quiet, oily labor that ensured the work of 1780 would not be interrupted by the failure of a single strap. The sorting of the seed, corn and the kernels counted, the quiet hours of the night by the light of a single candle, the selection of the seed took place. From the storage bin, you would bring a basket of the finest ears of corn, saved from the 1779 harvest. This was a task of extreme visual monotony. You had to shell each ear by hand, rubbing 2 ears together to pop the kernels loose into a wooden bowl. The sound was a dry, hollow clack, 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 a rhythmic percussion that filled the quiet kitchen. You would then inspect every single kernel, discarding any that were shriveled, discolored, or nipped by frost. Only the plumpest, most perfect seeds were placed into the planting bag. This was the boring history of the future. Each kernel you held was a potential stalk of grain, a link in the chain of survival. Your eyes would grow weary from the repetition, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the table. But you didn't rush. One bad seed in the ground was a wasted space in the field. By the time the bag was full, the fire was nothing but embers, and you held in your hand the entire hope of the coming summer, the harrowing and the dust of the plain. Once the field was plowed, it remained a jagged landscape of heavy clods. To prepare the seed bed, the harrow was brought out, a heavy wooden frame set with iron teeth. You would walk behind the oxen as they dragged this heavy weight across the furrows, breaking the clumps into a fine, smooth powder. The sound was a continuous metallic scrape crunch as the teeth bit into the earth. A fine cloud of spring dust would rise, coating your clothes, your beard, and your skin until you were the color of the field itself. You moved in a crosshatch pattern, up and down, then side to side, until the earth felt like velvet beneath your boots. This was the most meditative part of the spring labor. The urgency of the plowing was gone, replaced by the slow, dusty rhythm of the smoothing. As the sun set, the field lay flat and silent, a dark, empty canvas waiting for the seeds you had sorted in the night. The boring history of the soil was ready for its first chapter of growth, the breaking of the hemp and the fiber of strength. The late winter of 1779 gripped the colonies. The focus shifted to one of the most physically demanding and repetitive tasks of the year, the breaking of the hemp. Hemp was essential for the thick ropes, heavy sacks, and durable wagon covers needed for the spring. The stalks, which had been rotted in the autumn rain, and then dried, were now brittle sticks. To get to the fiber inside, you had to use a hemp brake, a heavy wooden lever that crushed the woody core. You would stand in the drafty barn for hours, lifting the heavy wooden arm and bringing it down with a resounding clack thud on a bundle of stalks. Each strike shattered the outer sheaves, which fell to the floor in a pile of golden splinters. The air became thick with a fine herbal dust that coated your lungs and made your skin itch. It was a monotonous, bone-wearying labor that required a steady, unthinking rhythm. You moved through the mountain of stalks, bundle by bundle, until your arms felt like lead. But by the end of the day, you were left with a handful of long, silver-gray fibers, the raw material of strength that would eventually pull the plows and secure the cargo for the next year of survival. the season of the short rations and the inner quiet. By February, the abundance of the autumn harvest was a fading memory, and the colonial home entered the season of short rations. The cellar bins were growing empty, and the barrels of salt pork were reaching their bottoms. This was a time of enforced stillness. To conserve energy and food, the family moved more slowly, their actions dictated by the need to preserve every calorie. The boring history of February was one of intense internal quiet. You would spend the afternoons sitting by the fire, perhaps carving a single wooden spoon or mending a small tear in a mitten. The conversations were sparse, centered on the simple counting of the remaining stores. How many potatoes? How many jars of cider? There was no panic, only a stoic, quiet acceptance of the lean weeks ahead. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of the snow outside. You lived in a state of semi-meditation, listening to the crackle of the fire and the whistle of the wind, waiting for the first sign of a thaw that would bring the early greens and the return of the life-giving sun, the panning of the lye and the alchemy of the hearth. In the final weeks before the thaw, the accumulated wood ashes from the winter's fires were put to use in the leaching. You would pack the ashes into a large wooden V-shaped hopper, pouring water slowly over the top. This water would trickle through the ash, emerging at the bottom as a dark, caustic liquid known as lye. The process was agonizingly slow. Drip, drip, drip. You would sit nearby, watching the dark liquid collect in a wooden bucket, its acrid chemical smell filling the air. This lye was the essential ingredient for the year's soap making. It was a dangerous, powerful substance, and you handled it with a quiet, focused respect. This was the boring history of chemistry, turning the waste of the fireplace into the means of cleanliness. The ritual of the leaching signaled that the winter was nearly over. The cycle of fire was ending, and the cycle of water and growth was about to begin again. The first sugar snow and the pulse of the trees. The transition into March was marked by the sugar snow, a light, wet dusting of snow that signaled the sap was rising in the maples. You would walk into the woods, your boots sinking into the slush, carrying a wooden mallet and a handful of spiles, taps, made of hollowed-out elderberry branches. The task was one of gentle, rhythmic percussion. You would bore a small hole in the bark of a great maple and tap the spile in with a soft thwack. Then you would wait. The first drop of clear, cold sap would appear at the end of the spile, hanging like a crystal before falling into the wooden bucket with a distinct ping. This sound, the ping, ping, ping of the sap, was the first music of the spring. You would spend the next week in a constant, slow-motion loop, hauling heavy buckets of sap to the boiling fires, watching the steam rise into the cold blue sky. It was a labor of sweetness and steam, the final chapter of the winter, and the first promise of the 1779 harvest, the first bloom of the orchard and the gentle pruning, as the warmth of late April 1779 finally reached the deep roots of the apple and cherry trees. The orchard transformed into a pale, fragrant cloud. This was a season of quiet, upward labor. You would spend the morning with a small, curved pruning knife, moving slowly from tree to tree. The task was to remove the suckers, the small vertical shoots that drained the strength of the tree without providing fruit. The sound was a soft, rhythmic snip-snip, followed by the gentle rustle of falling twigs hitting the grass. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms and the humming of the first heavy bumblebees. This was a meditative work. You had to look at each branch and imagine the weight of the fruit that would hang there in 6 months' time. You were shaping the future harvest with every cut. The sun was mild, and the grass beneath your boots was wet with the morning's dew. There was no rush, only the steady, unhurried focus on the health of the wood. By the time you finished a single row, the shadows of the branches would have shifted across the ground, a sundial of blossom and branch marking the slow passage of a perfect spring day. The lambing and the soft echoes of the fold, while the trees bloomed, the fold became the center of the farm's emotional and physical life. This was the season of the spring lambs. The work was nocturnal and gentle. You would spend the night in the barn, sitting on a bale of hay with a dim lantern, waiting for the arrival of the new life. The silence of the barn was filled with the rhythmic breathing of the ewes and the occasional low baa. When a lamb was born, your task was to ensure it was dried and feeding. You would use a piece of coarse, warm flannel to rub the small, shivering creature, feeling the frantic heartbeat against your palm. The boring history of lambing was a study in patience. You would sit for hours in the semi-darkness, watching the first wobbly steps of the lambs on the straw. The smell of the barn, a mix of dry hay, warm wool, and milk, was a comfort against the cool night air outside. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the barn boards, you would see a dozen new lives resting in the straw, a silent, soft victory for the farm that ensured the wool and meat for the years to come. The rhythms of the pail and the first green milk. With the birth of the lambs and calves came the return of the milk cycle. After the dry months of winter, the first flow of fresh milk was a luxury that signaled the end of the lean season. You would walk to the barn at 5 a.m, the heavy wooden pails swinging from a yoke across your shoulders. The cows, having finally tasted the first sweet June grass, were heavy and content. The sound of milking was the most consistent rhythm of the farm. The steady ping-ping swish-swish of the milk hitting the bottom of the tin pail. You would sit on a 3-legged stool, your forehead pressed against the warm, rough flank of the cow, moving your hands in a synchronized rhythmic squeeze. This was a time of internal quiet. The world outside was waking up, birds singing in the orchard, the sun hitting the tops of the pines. But inside the barn, there was only the warmth of the animal and the rising steam from the milk. Each cow had her own temperament, and you moved between them with a quiet, familiar grace. By the time the pails were full and carried back to the dairy, your arms were heavy, but the kitchen would soon be filled with the smell of fresh cream and the slow, rhythmic thump of the butter churn. The turning of the sod and the garden's gate. The final task of the late spring was the turning of the kitchen garden. While the large fields were for the grains, the garden was for the survival of the family's palate. You would spend the afternoon with a heavy spade, turning over the dark, rich soil of the raised beds. Every spadeful of earth had to be broken apart by hand, checking for stones and witchgrass roots. The work was slow and grounding. You moved in a steady line, your shadow growing long as the afternoon progressed. The soil felt cool and moist, smelling of ancient rotted compost and new life. Once the earth was smooth, you would use a string stretched between 2 pegs to mark the perfectly straight rows for the peas, lettuce, and radishes. The boring history of the garden was the history of the dinner table. You would drop the small, hard seeds into the furrows, covering them with a gentle pat of the hand. As you closed the small wooden gate of the garden to keep out the rabbits and deer, you felt a sense of completion. The earth was sown, the animals were fed, and the cycle of 1779 was now firmly in the hands of the sun and the rain, the rising humidity, and the cultivation of the corn. By early July 1779, the gentle spring had vanished, replaced by a thick, suffocating humidity that sat heavy over the colonies. The corn, planted in May, was now waist-high and growing with a speed that felt almost visible. However, this growth brought the great competition, the weeds. You would spend the long, stagnant afternoons moving through the rows with a heavy hand hoe. This was a world of green corridors. Once you entered the cornfield, the house and barn disappeared, and you were alone with the earth and the heat. The labor was a repetitive rhythmic strike. Chop, pull, step. You had to be careful not to nick the shallow roots of the corn while decapitating the persistent crabgrass and pigweed. The air between the rows was still, smelling of damp earth and the sweet, slightly dusty scent of the corn leaves. Sweat would sting your eyes and soak into the collar of your linen shirt, but you couldn't stop. In 1776, a fouled field meant a diminished harvest, and a diminished harvest meant a hungry winter. You moved with a robotic, unhurried precision, the only sound being the rhythmic thwack of the iron blade hitting the soil, and the occasional dry rustle of the leaves against your shoulders, the midsummer sheep wash and the river's chill. Before the second shearing of the year could take place, the sheep had to be washed, a task that combined physical chaos with a strange, cooling monotony. You would drive the flock down to a shallow, gravel-bottomed bend in the creek. One by one, the heavy, wool-laden animals were led into the waist-deep water. This was a struggle of muscle against instinct. You would grasp the sheep by its thick fleece and dunk it into the cool flow, scrubbing the wool with your bare hands to remove the accumulated yolk, grease, dust, and meadow bits. The water was bitingly cold compared to the humid air, providing a brief, shivering relief. The sound of the afternoon was a chaotic symphony. The frantic baying of the sheep, the splashing of water, and the shouts of the men echoing off the trees. As each sheep was finished, it would scramble back to the bank, looking half its size, its wool a brilliant, dripping white. You would spend hours in the water until your legs were numb and your skin was pruned. It was a grueling, messy process. But as you watched the clean sheep drying in the sun, you knew that the wool they provided would be the finest, softest fiber for the winter's spinning wheels. The hayrick and the geometry of the stackin. The fields, the cut hay from June was now dry and ready to be housed. This was the season of the hayrick, the art of building a massive, weatherproof stack that would sit in the meadow until winter. You would stand atop the growing mound while the oxen-drawn wagons brought load after load of loose, fragrant grass. Your job was to spread the hay evenly, treading it down with your boots to remove any air pockets that could lead to rot or spontaneous combustion. Building a rick was a slow exercise in the structural geometry. You had to ensure the center was higher than the edges, so that rain would shed off the sides like water off a duck's back. You moved in a constant, slow-motion circle, your pitchfork moving in a rhythmic lift-toss tread. The smell was intoxicating, the concentrated scent of 1,000 dried wildflowers and sun-baked clover. By late afternoon, the rick would be 20 feet high, a golden monument to the summer's labor. You would slide down the side, your clothes covered in hay dust and your throat parched, looking back at the stack with a sense of quiet triumph. It was a massive, silent insurance policy against the coming snows, the firefly vigil and the stillness of July. The final hour of a July day in 1779 was the only time of true peace. After the final milking and the sealing of the poultry house, you would sit on the back stoop, the wood still radiating in the day's heat. This was the firefly vigil. As the purple twilight deepened, thousands of tiny, rhythmic pulses of yellow light would begin to flicker in the tall grass of the orchard. There was no sound but the rhythmic sawing of the katydids and the distant, lonely call of a whippoorwill. You would sit in a state of total stillness, your hands, rough and stained from the hoe and the sheep wash, resting in your lap. The air would slowly cool, bringing the scent of evening primrose and damp hay. This was the boring history of the soul, a moment where time seemed to stretch and stop. You weren't thinking of the revolution, or the taxes, or the next day's labor. You were simply a part of the landscape, a quiet observer of the eternal rhythm of the colonial night, until the last glow of the sun vanished behind the hills, and the heavy velvet darkness called you to your bed. The ripening of the rye and the golden sway. By early August 1779, the vibrant greens of the early summer had matured into a deep, heavy gold. The rye, the hardiest of the colonial grains, stood tall and bowed, its bearded heads heavy with the weight of the coming bread. This was the season of the golden sway. Before the wheat or the corn was ready, the rye demanded attention. You would stand at the edge of the field, testing the kernels with your thumbnail. They had to be hard and flinty, clicking against each other with a dry metallic sound. The harvest began at the first light of dawn, before the heat of the day could make the stalks brittle. You used a cradle scythe, a standard scythe fitted with a light wooden frame of long fingers designed to catch the grain as it was cut. The motion was a masterpiece of repetitive physics. Swing, catch, lay. With every arc, the cradle gathered a perfect bundle of rye and laid it in a neat swath on the ground. The sound was a rhythmic, musical swish-thump, the blade slicing the stalks and the cradle dropping the bundle. You moved in a steady line, your breath synchronized with the swing of your torso. By midday, the field was a pattern of golden rose, and the air was filled with the sweet, dry scent of fallen grain. This was a labor of immense focus. A single clumsy swing could shatter the heads and scatter the precious seeds. You were the bridge between the field and the flour barrel, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew that every bundle was a week of life, the binding of the sheaves and the geometry of the shock. While the mowers moved ahead, the binders followed close behind. This was a task of constant stooping and nimble fingers. You would gather a handful of the cut rye, separate a few long stalks, and twist them into a straw rope to bind the bundle into a firm sheaf. Once bound, the sheaves were gathered into shocks. Groups of 10 or 12 bundles stood upright against each other, with 2 more splayed across the top like a thatched roof to shed the rain. This was the architecture of the field. You moved through the rows, your hands becoming scratched by the stiff rye beards, and your back aching from the thousandth bend. A well-built shock was a work of art. It had to be sturdy enough to withstand a summer thunderstorm, but open enough to allow the wind to dry the grain. Looking back across the field, the sight of 100 golden shocks standing in the late afternoon sun was the first true visual proof of survival. The landscape was no longer a wild meadow. It was an organized, rhythmic storage of energy, a silent testament to the long days of the summer's heat. The threshing floor and the dust of the flail after. The grain had dried in the field for a week. It was hauled into the barn to face the flail. The threshing floor was the stage for the most monotonous and exhausting sound of the colonial year. You would lay the sheaves in 2 rows, heads facing each other, and begin the rhythmic beating. The flail, 2 sticks joined by a leather thong, moved in a constant overhead circle. Thwack, crack, thwack, crack. The sound echoed off the high rafters of the barn, a steady, hypnotic beat that could be heard for miles. As you struck the grain, the kernels were shaken loose from their husks, falling to the wooden floorboards. A fine, irritating dust rose with every strike, coating your skin and making the air taste of toasted straw. This was the boring history of the loaf. You would thresh for 4 hours, turn the grain with a wooden fork, and thresh for 4 more. There was no conversation, only the mechanical repetition of the swing and the strike. By evening, your shoulders felt like they had been forged in iron, and the floor was covered in a deep, golden carpet of rye, ready to be winnowed by the evening breeze. The evening sifting and the peace of the bin. The final act of the rye harvest was the winnowing. In the cool of the evening, when a steady draft moved through the wide barn doors, you would take up the shallow winnowing basket. You stood in the center of the floor, tossing the mixture of grain and chaff into the air. The light, papery husks were caught by the wind and carried out into the yard like a cloud of golden butterflies, while the heavy, clean grain fell back into the basket with a soft, metallic hiss. This was the moment of truth. You could feel the weight of the harvest in your arms, the density of the grain that would soon be ground into the dark, hearty rye bread of the winter. Each toss was a rhythmic meditation, a way to clear the mind of the day's heat and dust. When the last basket was funneled into the heavy oak bin, you would run your hand through the cool, smooth seeds. They felt like liquid gold. The barn was silent now, the dust settling in the fading light. You had turned the field into food, and as you walked back to the house under the first few stars, the rhythm of the flail still echoed in your bones, a steady beat of security in a world of change. The first apple pressing and the river of cider rays, September 1779, brought the first crisp nights to the colonies. The air in the orchards turned heavy with the scent of fermentation. The early drops, the tart wild apples that fell before the main harvest, were gathered in wooden hampers. This was the beginning of the cider heat. In an age where water was often suspect, cider was the lifeblood of the colonial household, consumed at every meal. You would spend the morning at the cider press, a massive wooden contraption that groaned under the weight of a hand-turned iron screw. The process was a study in slow liquid extraction. First, the apples were crushed into pumice using a hand-cranked mill. Then, the wet mash was layered between sheets of coarse burlap and straw, creating a cheese. As you turned the great lever, the wood would creak and protest, and a thick, amber stream of juice would begin to flow into the waiting tubs. The sound was a rhythmic drip-dash-splash, a liquid percussion that lasted for hours. By the end of the day, your hands were sticky with sugar and your back was weary, but the cellar was now home to several new barrels of sweet cider that would soon begin their slow, bubbling transformation into the hard cider that would sustain the family through the winter. The gathering of the hops and the bitter aroma along the edges of the garden, the hop vines had reached the top of their poles, their papery green cones heavy with lupulin, the yellow dust that gave beer its bitterness and preservative power. Harvesting hops was a delicate, fragrant labor. You would pull down the long poles and sit on a stool, picking the cones one by one into a large wicker basket. The boring history of hops was a sensory journey. As you handled the vines, the sticky resin would coat your fingers, smelling of pine, citrus, and earth. It was a drowsy work. The scent of hops was known to induce sleep, and the repetitive motion of picking, pluck, toss, was a quiet, hypnotic ritual. Once gathered, the cones were spread out on the floor of the kiln or dry loft to be cured by the heat of a small, controlled fire. You would spend the evening turning the hops with a wooden rake, the air becoming so thick with the bitter aroma that it felt like you were breathing the harvest itself. These dried flowers were the secret to the family's small beer, the light, everyday brew that was as essential to the colonial diet as bread, the salt boil and the preservation of the sea. In September, if you lived near the coast, or if a trader had arrived from the salt works, the great salting began. Salt was the only thing that stood between a family and starvation. It was the preservative for every piece of meat and fish that would be eaten in the coming year. You would spend the afternoon in the salt shed, rubbing coarse grains of sea salt into slabs of pork and beef. This was a tactile, rhythmic labor. You had to massage the salt into every crevice of the meat, feeling the graininess against your palms. The smell was sharp and mineral, a stark contrast to the sweet scents of the orchard. Once rubbed, the meat was packed into salting tubs, layered with more salt until it was completely buried. This was the boring history of the larder. You moved with a steady, unhurried pace, knowing that a single missed spot on a ham could lead to rot in January. It was a silent, gritty task, a way of freezing the summer's protein in a crystal shell, ensuring that the bounty of 1779 would last until the first green shoots of 1780. The flax brake and the silver fiber haze. The nights grew colder. The dried flax from the spring was brought out for the breaking. This was perhaps the most monotonous task of the entire year. The flax stalks were brittle sticks, and to get to the soft linen fiber inside, you had to crush the outer sheave using a heavy wooden lever called a flax brake. The sound was a rhythmic, wooden clack thud that echoed through the barn. You would stand there for hours, lifting the heavy arm and bringing it down on a handful of stalks, then moving to the next. The air became thick with a fine, sneezy dust. After breaking, the flax was scutched, hit with a wooden knife to knock away the broken bits, leaving behind long silver-gray tresses of fiber. It looked like the hair of an ancient spirit. This was the raw material for every shirt, sheet, and towel in the house. You would spend the entire week in this dusty, rhythmic toil, your arms aching from the weight of the brake, until a mountain of stalks had been reduced to a small, precious bundle of silver linen, ready for the spinning wheels of the winter, the killing frost, and the orange huddle. In late October the 1779, the boring history of the colonies was marked by a sudden crystalline stillness. You would wake to find the world glazed in a brittle, white fur. The killing frost had arrived, turning the once vibrant squash vines into black, shriveled ribbons. This was the signal for the great huddle. You would spend the entire morning in the fields, moving through the withered leaves to gather the pumpkins and hard-shelled squashes. Each gourd was a heavy, cold weight. You had to clip them from the vine with a sharp knife, leaving a few inches of stem to prevent rot. This was a slow, stooping labor. Cut, lift, carry. You would pile them into the ox cart, their orange rinds glowing against the frost-covered grass. Back at the house, they were wiped clean of damp earth and lined up along the south-facing wall of the barn to cure in the pale autumn sun. The sound was a rhythmic thump-clatter as they were moved, a heavy, hollow percussion that filled the yard. This orange barricade was your winter's vegetable store, a silent, sturdy promise of pies and stews that would last until the spring thaws. The scutching and the heckling of the linen. With the flax broken, the work moved to the scutching block. This was a task of rhythmic striking. You would hold a bundle of the crushed flax over the edge of a vertical board and hit it repeatedly with a long wooden scutching knife. The goal was to knock away every remaining bit of the woody core, leaving only the long silken fibers. Whack, whack, whack. The sound was sharp and repetitive, a dry drumming that filled the afternoon. Once scutched, the flax moved to the heckle, a board bristling with hundreds of long, sharp steel spikes. You would pull the flax through the spikes, a process called heckling, which combed out the short, tangled fibers, the tow, and left behind the line, the long, shimmering tresses of pure linen. This was a meditative, dangerous work. One slip of the hand, and the spikes would find your skin. The fiber felt cool and metallic in your hands, smelling of dry grass and dust. By the time you finished, the floor was covered in a nest of rough tow, and you held a bundle of silver gold linen that was ready for the winter spinning wheel. The rendering of the tallow and the scent of the Killis November brought the first true meat cold. The annual slaughtering began. While the meat was salted, the waste was turned into light. This was the day of the great rendering. Every scrap of beef and mutton fat was tossed into a massive iron cauldron over an outdoor fire. The sound was a constant low-level hiss and bubble. You would stand by the pot for hours with a long wooden skimmer, removing the cracklings, the bits of skin and gristle. As the fat melted into a clear, golden liquid, the smell was heavy, acrid, and oily. The smell of survival. This liquid tallow was then strained through a cloth into wooden tubs to cool and harden. This was the boring history of the dark months. This fat was the only thing that would keep the darkness at bay in December. You moved with a slow, careful gait, carrying the heavy pails of liquid fire to be into the shed, the steam from the pot rising into the cold, gray sky like a signal fire for the coming winter, the banking of the foundation, and the final ceiling. The final act of the working year was the banking of the house. to keep the frost from creeping under the floorboards and freezing the root cellar. You had to build a barricade of earth and debris against the foundation. You would spend the afternoon with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, hauling mounds of dried leaves, pine boughs, and soil to the base of the cabin. This was a task of heavy, grounding geometry. You would pack the insulation tight, damping it down with your boots until the bottom 3 feet of the house were encased in a protective mound. The sound was a rhythmic scrape thud of the shovel and the rustle of dry leaves. Inside, you would take tow or moss and chink any new gaps that had appeared between the logs as the wood shrank in the cold air. The house felt more solid, more silent, as if it were hunkering down into the earth itself. As the sun set, a pale, cold sliver in the November sky, you would stand back and survey the house. It was now a fortress, sealed against the north wind, ready for the long, white silence that would soon erase the roads and the fields of 1779, the first great snow and the muffling of the world. The transition into the winter of 1779 happened overnight. You woke not to the sound of the wind, but to an absolute, heavy silence, the kind that only comes when the world is buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. The first great snow had arrived, erasing the boundaries between the garden, the road, and the fields. Your first task was the breaking of the path. Using a heavy wooden shovel carved from a single slab of ash, you began the slow, rhythmic labor of carving a canyon from the back door to the barn. The sound was a soft, repetitive shush thump as the cold snow was heaved aside. The air was so still, you could hear the distant snap of a frozen branch a mile away. This was the boring history of winter movement. You weren't traveling to town or visiting neighbors. You were simply reclaiming the 20 yards of earth that allowed your livestock to be fed. The snow was light and dry, swirling around your wool leggings, and your breath hung in the air, like the steam from a tea kettle. By the time the path was clear, your heart was thumping against your ribs, and the house stood like an island in a sea of white, its only connection to the world being the thin ribbon of smoke rising straight up from the chimney, the great wheel, and the song of the wool, with the world outside frozen in place. The center of gravity in the colonial home shifted to the great wheel. This was the season of the wool spinning. The rolags you had carded in November were now ready to be transformed into yarn. Spinning on a great wheel, or walking wheel, was a task of constant motion. You would stand beside the large wooden wheel, spinning it with your right hand, while walking backward to draw out the fiber with your left. The sound was a low, hypnotic whir, hum, click that filled the room for hours. You would walk miles in a single afternoon without ever leaving the hearth side, backwards to twist the yarn, forwards to wind it onto the spindle. This was the boring history of the fabric. Your eyes were fixed on the point of the twist, watching the messy wool fibers lock together into a strong, even thread. The rhythm became a part of your body, the swing of the arm, the step of the foot. By evening, the spindle was fat with creamy, sheep-scented yarn, and your legs were weary from the long walk of the spinner. This yarn was the potential for every sock, mitten, and blanket that would keep the frost at bay during the coming February thaws, the quill and the ledger of the dying year. In the late evening, when the wheel was stilled and the children were tucked under heavy quilts in the loft, the head of the house would move to the small writing desk. This was the time for the account of 1779. By the light of a single tallow dip, you would sharpen a goose quill with a small penknife. a slow, delicate task that required a steady hand and a keen eye. The sound was the rhythmic scratch of the nib against the rough, handmade paper. You were recording the history of the farm's survival. 12 bushels of rye in the bin, 3 barrels of cider remaining, 1 cow lost to the winter fever. This was a silent, solemn ritual. You were weighing the labor of the summer against the needs of the winter. The ink was thick and smelled of iron and oak gall. As you sanded the wet pages to dry the ink, the flickering candlelight cast long, wavering shadows of the herbs hanging from the rafters. This ledger was the memory of the land, a record of persistence in a world where nothing was guaranteed except the return of the seasons and the necessity of the work. The banking of the Embers and the dream of 1780. The final act of the year 1779 was the Great Banking. As the fire in the hearth burned down to a deep, glowing orange, you would use the long iron peel to gather the coals into a mound at the back of the fireplace. You then covered them with a thick, insulating layer of white ash, effectively putting the fire to sleep. This ensured that even in the sub-zero temperatures of a New England night, the seed of the fire would remain alive for the morning. You stood there for a final moment in the dark kitchen, the only light being the faint, red glow seeping through the ash. The house was settling, the timbers popping with the cold, like distant pistol shots. You could feel the immense weight of the winter pressing against the walls, yet inside there was warmth, food, and the quiet breathing of your kin. You had successfully navigated the boring history of another year. 1779 was now a closed book, its stories written in the woodpile, the haymow, and the jars in the cellar. As you climbed the ladder to the loft, the world outside was a frozen wilderness, but your mind was already moving toward the first thaw of March and the eternal promise of the 1780 planting. The deep freeze and the timber cryas. January 1780 settled over the landscape. The colonies entered what would be remembered as one of the most brutal winters of the century. The boring history of this month was defined by the sound of the timber cry. The temperature dropped so low that the sap remaining deep within the hearts of the great oaks and maples would freeze and expand, causing the trunks to explode with a sound like a sudden musket shot echoing through the frozen woods. You would spend the day indoors, the world outside, a crystalline, lethal blue. Your primary occupation was the feeding of the hearth. To keep the house habitable, the fire had to be fed massive logs of seasoned hickory every few hours. You would move from the woodpile to the hearth in a hurried, rhythmic dash, your breath freezing instantly into a white mask on your scarf. Inside, you would sit as close to the flames as safety allowed, the front of your body baking, while your back remained chilled by the drafts. This was a time of extreme physical contraction. You lived in a radius of 6 feet around the fire, moving only to fetch water from the melted snow on the crane, or to check the salt box for the evening's meal. The monotony was your shield. By maintaining the rhythm of the fire, you were holding back the encroaching ice that threatened to turn the house into a tomb. The winter cobbling and the waxed thread, with the fields inaccessible and the barn chores reduced to a quick, shivering minimum, the afternoon hours were dedicated to the winter cobbling. In 1780, a hole in a boot was not a nuisance. It was a precursor to frostbite. You would sit on the cobbler's bench, a small, specialized wooden seat with compartments for brass tacks and leather scraps. The task was to reinforce the soles of the family's footwear with clouts of heavy cowhide. The sound was a rhythmic, muffled thump-tap-tap as you hammered the tacks into the thick leather. You would use a stitching awl to pull a heavy waxed linen thread through the seams, a motion that required a steady rhythmic pull of the arms. The smell was a potent mix of old leather, pine resin, and the acrid scent of the shoemaker's wax used to waterproof the thread. This was a labor of absolute focus. You were building a barrier between the human foot and the frozen earth. Each stitch was a slow, deliberate act of protection. As you worked, the ice on the inside of the window panes would grow in intricate, fern-like patterns, a silent, frozen garden that mirrored the slow, steady growth of the repair in your hands, the sifting of the flour and the bread logic. In the kitchen, the boring history of survival centered on the bread logic. The grain that had been harvested in the golden heat of August and ground at the mill in October was now a cold, white powder in the bottom of the flour chest. To make the daily loaf, you had to sift the flour through a fine linen bolting cloth to remove any remaining bits of bran or the occasional weevil. The sound was a soft, continuous shh, 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 as the flour fell into the wooden trough. This was a dusty, meditative work. You would then mix the flour with emptins, the yeasty dregs from the bottom of a cider or beer barrel, and a bit of warm water. The kneading was a rhythmic, physical conversation with the dough. You would push, fold, and turn, your knuckles growing white with the effort until the dough felt alive and springy under your palms. This was the most essential alchemy of 1780. You were turning dry dust and cold water into the staff of life. The dough would rise slowly near the warmth of the hearth, a silent expansion that mirrored the slow passage of the winter day. When the loaf was finally slid into the brick oven on a long wooden peel, the smell of baking bread would fill the house, a warm, yeasty promise that despite the timber cry outside, the family remained fed and secure. The final tally and the threshold of 1780, the final hour of this 4-year epic, brings us to the threshold. You stand at the small frosted window, looking out at a world that has been your laboratory of survival since 1776. The boring history of these years was not written in the blood of battles, but in the grease of the wool, the salt of the pork, and the ash of the hearth. You have navigated 1,000 small cycles. The birth of lambs, the drying of hay, the dipping of candles, and the mending of plows. You take the heavy iron poker and stir the fire one last time, the sparks dancing up the chimney like a swarm of golden bees. The house is a repository of every hour you have invested in its maintenance. The beams overhead are seasoned by your smoke. The floorboards are polished by your footsteps. You feel a deep, quiet pride in the monotony. In a world of chaos and revolution, you have maintained the order of the seasons. You have proven that the greatest strength is not found in a single heroic act, but in the infinite repetition of small, honest labors. As you climb the ladder to bed, the wind of 1780 howls against the roof, but you do not fear it. You are a part of the land, and the land is a part of you. The epic is not over. It is simply waiting for the first thaw of March to begin the story all over again. The Great Ice Hall and the Crystal Harvest. By mid-February 1780, the deep freeze freeze had reached its absolute peak, turning the local ponds and slow-moving creeks into solid blocks of blue-black crystal. This was the season of the Great Ice Haul. While the world seemed dead, you were looking forward to the heat of the coming July. To keep your dairy cool and your meat preserved in the summer, you had to harvest the winter's cold now. You would head out to the pond with a long, heavy ice saw and a team of oxen. The labor was a masterpiece of slow, rhythmic percussion. First, you used an iron ice plow to score the surface into a grid. Then, the sawing began. Zing-shush, zing-shush. The sound was sharp and metallic, echoing off the frozen hills. You would stand on the ice for hours, your legs vibrating with the effort as the long blade bit through 12 inches of frozen water. Once a block was free, you used iron ice tongs to heave the massive slippery cube onto a wooden sledge. Each block weighed nearly 100 pounds. A cold, heavy burden that required the steady, slow-motion pull of the oxen to move. The ice house and the insulation of sawdust. The destination for these crystal blocks was the ice house, a small, windowless building partially buried in a north-facing hillside. This was the boring history of refrigeration. You couldn't just stack the ice. You had to insulate it against its own nature. You would spend the afternoon in the dark, chilled interior of the ice house, layering the blocks with a thick coating of dry pine sawdust, saved from the spring's milling. Each block was fitted together like a giant, frozen puzzle. You used a wooden mallet to pack the sawdust into the gaps, a rhythmic thud-thump that sounded muffled in the enclosed space. The smell was a mix of fresh-cut wood and the sterile, odorless cold of the ice. This was a labor of extreme foresight. Every hour spent hauling ice in the sub-zero wind was an hour of comfort bought for the humid days of August. As you stacked the final layer and covered it with a mountain of straw, the ice house became a vault of winter, a silent, frozen heart that would keep the milk sweet and the butter firm long after the snow outside had vanished. The winter distillation and the essence of cider, with the farm bound in ice, the colonial kitchen often turned to the winter distillation, specifically the creation of applejack. This was not done with a fire still, but with the cold itself, a process known as freeze distillation. You would take a barrel of hard cider from the cellar and leave it outside in the bitter night air. Each morning you would go out to the barrel. The water in the cider would freeze into a layer of clear ice, leaving the concentrated alcohol in the center. You would use a long wooden spoon to skim away the ice crystals, a rhythmic clink scrape that lasted for weeks. Each day, the liquid grew darker, thicker, and more potent. This was the boring history of the spirit. You weren't rushing a chemical process. You were letting the winter itself refine the harvest of the previous autumn. The resulting Jersey lightning was a potent apple-scented essence that could warm a man's blood in the middle of a blizzard. You would funnel the dark liquid into small stone jugs, the smell of fermented fruit filling the cold air. A liquid fire forged in the heart of the frost, the final scour, and the preparation for the sapes. The sun began to climb slightly higher in the sky toward the end of February. The boring history of 1780 turned toward the final scour. Every wooden bucket, every spile, and every boiling pan intended for the maple season had to be cleaned of the dust and cobwebs of a year's storage. You would sit by the hearth with a bucket of hot water and a handful of coarse, scouring rushes, horsetail plants. The sound was a constant rhythmic scrub, scrub, scrub of the rushes against the wooden staves. You had to ensure that no mold or old sugar remained to spoil the new sap. It was a repetitive, wet labor that made your fingers prune and your back ache. But as the buckets were cleaned and stacked in the yard, they looked like a silent army waiting for the first thaw. This was the bridge between the seasons. The ice harvest was over, the mending was finished, and the first pulse of the new year was about to beat within the maples. You stood in the yard, the air still cold enough to bite, looking at the clean white wood of the buckets and realizing that the long, boring winter was finally reaching its end, making way for the sweet, steaming labor of the spring.